I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story and all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 51, A Great Price Cut. The morning light was bright, and the autumn breeze was just right. Greevy and Armand, dressed in tight-fitting hunting attire, rode tall horses, double-barreled shotguns slung over their shoulders, through their private forest. Servants lined up at the other end, leading their hunting dogs, who trotted along, their task being to drive the prey to the area in front of the two for their amusement. This might be the last hunt of the year. Armand, Greevy skillfully controlled his horse, his gaze drifting over the falling leaves on either side, a hint of regret in his voice. Once winter comes, the prey will hide in their dens, and you won't find them even if you dig 3 feet into the ground. Armand rode lazily behind, yawning boredly, and replied, "That's why I prefer the prey in bed, Greevy. They're always there waiting for me, and I can do whatever I want with them." Greevy laughed heartily, but a sudden noise caught his attention. He quickly stopped laughing and looked alertly into the bushes. A weary deer came into view, panting heavily, perhaps exhausted from running. Greevy quickly stopped his horse, skillfully unhooked his hunting rifle, and aimed at the target. Just as Greevy was about to pull the trigger, the approaching sound of hooves startled the target away. Greevy sullenly put away his rifle, cursing, "Damn it," and turned to look at his approaching servant. If it wasn't something important, he was going to get a beating. Mr. Greevy, the servant reined in his horse and stopped beside Greevy. "As you expected, Dejoko went to the city hall today to process the industrial property rights for the sidecar motorcycles. We were trying to discuss purchasing the property rights with him, but someone else beat us to it." Greevy's face darkened. "Beat us to it? The left wing?" "No, Mr. Greevy," the servant replied, "it was Galini. He didn't buy the property rights, he placed an order on behalf of the military." Greevy looked up in shock. If the military had placed an order, purchasing the property rights wouldn't be easy. Armand beside him gave a cryptic smile. The military's swift order, bypassing the Senate, indicated that Galini had already included the sidecar motorcycle in the wartime procurement regulations, the second piece of equipment to be included. "Galini is very bold," Armand said. "He dares to offend both the left and right wings." The Saint-Étienne machine gun was left-wing equipment, while the sidecar motorcycle was something the right wing desired, but Galini had interfered with both. Greevy asked expressionlessly, "What's the purchase price? Has an agreement been reached?" "Yes, sir," the servant replied. "I heard it's 550 francs. Greevy exclaimed in surprise. 550 francs? "Are you sure?" "Yes, sir." Without another word, Greevy spurred his horse and galloped towards the villa. Confused, Armand spurred his horse to catch up, shouting from the jolting saddle, "What's wrong, Greevy?" "Because of the 550 francs, yes," Greevy replied amidst the clatter of hoofs. "What does this have to do with us?" Armand asked, bewildered. "We didn't buy the rights to it. Think about tanks." Greevy turned unanswered. "We're planning to sell them to the military for 6,000 francs each." Armand remained bewildered. In his mind, tanks and sidecars were unrelated, different things. "Think about it, Armand," Greevy explained. "The money for one tank can buy 10 sidecars. Which would you prefer?" Armand froze, his horse stopping abruptly and falling far behind. 10 sidecars could be equipped with 10 Maxim guns, while a tank could only be equipped with 1 machine gun. Tanks also had many disadvantages, such as slow speed and frequent malfunctions. The military, of course, preferred 10 sidecars. Greevy ignored Armand, spurred his horse back to the villa, jumped off at the door, rushed inside, and dialed the phone as fast as he could, anxiously ordering, 5,000 francs, sign the contract immediately, right now, . When the military representative returned, he was much more relaxed, even sporting a slight smile. Francis sensed something was wrong, but he still pretended to be nonchalant. "You're lucky, Louis. They don't want to waste time, so they're offering you 5,000 francs per tank. Sign the contract." "Sorry, Francis," Louis smiled. "Perhaps 3,000 francs per tank would be acceptable." This is outrageous, Francis instantly lost his composure. "This is an insult to us. This is a tank, Louis, you need it." "I know," Louis interrupted Francis, "but we have a substitute, and it only costs 550 francs. Francis instantly understood what was going on. That guy Joka, he actually sold the sidecar motorcycle for a low price of 550 francs. This was something Charles hadn't expected. In his view, tanks and sidecar motorcycles shouldn't be in price competition. So, when he heard Joka say that the military had used the sidecar motorcycle to lower the price of the tank to 3,000 francs and reached an agreement, he found it somewhat unbelievable. After thinking about it for a while, Charles understood. At this time, the army lacked the concept of armored warfare or mobile warfare. In their eyes, tanks and sidecar motorcycles were probably no different. Both were armored, both carried machine guns, and both could inflict heavy casualties with small units. Since they were similar, why would the military choose tanks at a high price instead of the cheaper, faster, and less prone to break down sidecar motorcycles? Did General Gallieni genuinely not know the difference between the two, or was he pretending not to know to lower the price? Charles believed that Gallieni probably genuinely didn't know. After all, tanks had only just appeared, and combat theory was practically non-existent. The same applied to sidecar motorcycles. They didn't understand that each had its advantages and disadvantages, and neither could replace the other. And this, Joka handed Charles a telegram. "This is from Joseph in England. The British have agreed to sell the Holt 75 production line and provide full technical support, but they are asking for 500,000 francs. A hint of anxiety flashed in Joka's eyes. 500,000 francs was beyond their purchasing power unless they received payment from the military for the sidecar motorcycles immediately. But Charles wasn't in a hurry. He calmly said, "Let Joseph talk to them about the price again. We've already talked many times, Charles," Joka said helplessly. "Joseph said he's done his best, and this is probably the lowest price the British have offered." Charles replied softly, "Tell Joseph, 250,000 francs, no higher." "That's impossible." Joka stared at Charles in disbelief. Charles added, "Otherwise, we'll wait for the Holt 120 to come out and tell the British that." Joka was stunned. The Holt 120 was coming out? This meant the Holt 75 was a product about to be phased out. And the British actually wanted to sell it at a high price. Chapter 52. This is called a minor problem? Joka didn't know where Charles got the information. He only knew that shortly after sending the telegram to Joseph, he received a reply. "The other party agrees to sell for 250,000 francs. Do you wish to purchase?" Joka readily replied yes, then jumped into his car and headed to Paris to process the cross-border payment at the bank. Note: cross-border payments in Europe developed in the mid-19th century, using the correspondent banking model, which continues to this day. Joka hesitated for a moment when signing at the bank counter. He didn't quite understand why Charles would be willing to spend 250,000 francs to buy a technology and product that was about to be obsolete. However, considering that Charles insisted on this despite knowing the truth, he must have his reasons, and Joka ultimately signed and wired the money. Charles did indeed have his reasons. His purpose in buying the Holt 75 was not to produce tractors, but to produce tanks and armored vehicles. What he truly needed was engine technology, and in this respect, the Holt 120 did not have a significant advantage over the Holt 75. The former was more about physically increasing the engine size to achieve greater output power. This is why the Holt 75 wasn't discontinued or truly phased out until 10 years later. Joka spent an afternoon traveling back and forth between the town of Darvaz and Paris, only returning home as darkness fell. Charles was confined to his room for the entire day, and even when he asked to go to Paris with Joka, Camille flatly refused. "These things don't need you, Charles," Camille said. "Your father can handle it all." Then Camille joked, "Don't worry, Charles. Joka has to grow up eventually. It's time to let him do things." Joka raised his head and scoffed in protest, but a sour feeling welled up inside him. Camille was at least partially telling the truth. He did indeed rely on Charles's decisions. But that was Charles, the child I raised. Seeing him surpass me was a source of pride. The next day, Charles was finally allowed to go to the factory with Joka. After a simple breakfast and a farewell to Camille, they got into the Ford and drove to the factory. As the car drove down the street, neighbors waved and greeted them. Aunt Elisa, who sold croissants, waved enthusiastically. "Young Master Charles, would you like a croissant? It's free, I just had breakfast." "Thank you, Aunt Elisa," Charles turned back to express his gratitude from the moving car. She's keeping her promise. Dejoka, sitting in the driver's seat, glanced back slightly. What? Charles didn't understand. Dejoka explained, Aunt Elisa's son is a wounded soldier, half his hand was severed by a shrapnel and he can't continue serving. She wants to find him a job at a motorcycle factory, and I agreed. She said we can have her croissants for free, if we want. Charles said remembering his promise to provide jobs for wounded soldiers at the field hospital. Dejoka asked curiously, what do you plan to do with those wounded soldiers? They're having a hard time adapting to work in the motorcycle factory, some even need care. Charles didn't hesitate. We can set up a wounded soldier's home, manage them centrally, and give them some simple parts and machines to process, paid by the piece. Dejoka hesitated for a moment, then nodded. A good idea, letting them try to support themselves. Yes, Charles said, this won't cost us anything, or at least not much. Only this way can it be sustainable, otherwise, we won't be able to support so many wounded soldiers, and countless more will need our support in the future. Dejoka agreed. They'll be grateful. Charles, you've given them the opportunity to earn their own living. Charles unconsciously thought of Matthew. Would he accept this kind of supporting themselves life? For him, it would just be another way of waiting to die. The car suddenly slowed down. Dejoka looked out the window, his voice tinged with panic. What's going on? Charles followed Dejoka's gaze and saw a squad of French soldiers in red trousers and hats, heavily armed, had appeared in front of the factory. They had set up a checkpoint on the only way in, checking every vehicle and worker entering the factory. What are they looking for? Dejoka looked around. German spies. Charles didn't understand what was happening at first, until he saw an officer with a bruised and swollen face. That's Laurent, father, Charles said. They're sent by General Gallieri. Gallieri had introduced Laurent to the two of them that night and knew he was trustworthy. Dejoka said and then he saw Laurent as well. Soon, Dejoka became worried again. Shouldn't he keep his distance from us? Why send his trusted aides? Charles raised an eyebrow. That's normal, father. This is where tanks and sidecars are manufactured. The military should be worried about German spies infiltrating and stealing our technology. Dejoka nodded in agreement with Charles. Just then, Laurent saw Dejoka, walked to the car with a stern face, and asked expressionlessly, your identification, sir. Dejoka took out his identification from his inner pocket and handed it over. Note, France was one of the first countries to use identity cards, originating during the French Revolution. These were used to prove citizenship and prevent tax evasion, but they were paper-based and easily forged. Laurent took the document and unfolded it, glancing furtively to his sides to make sure no one was approaching. He whispered, don't worry, sir, we're here to protect you. However, our attitude might be a little problematic. Laurent straightened up, head held high, and said loudly, you're Dejoka? The one who sold us the motorcycle for 550 francs. You capitalists never consider the hardships of ordinary people, only thinking about making more money. With that, Laurent threw the document hard at Dejoka's face. You vampires. I warn you, don't try anything funny. He then spat on the ground, and several nearby soldiers joined in with a chorus of laughter. However, Laurent failed to notice the murderous expressions on the faces of the surrounding workers. Before he could say anything, workers shouted, hey, watch your attitude, you bastard. They're heroes who saved France. Show some respect. Stop your arrogance, you ignorant and haughty fools. The workers' shouts grew louder and louder, and in a fit of rage, they pushed and shoved the soldiers forward. Laurent was even knocked to the ground by a burly man who lunged at him, his hat flying far away. The soldiers, afraid to confront the workers with their guns, hastily grabbed Laurent and escorted him away amidst the workers' curses, while the workers cheered in victory. Dejoka and Charles exchanged bewildered glances. Did Laurent call this a minor problem? Or had he simply not expected this outcome? Chapter 53. Thank you all for your support. I'll try to update 3 times a week starting tomorrow. This week, we successfully advanced to the second round of recommendations. Starting tomorrow, I will try my best to update 3 times a day, still at 10 p.m. every night. However, since I write part-time and am a beginner, I'm not a fast writer, so please forgive me if I can't update 3 times a day occasionally. I've received the donations and read all the comments, but I can't reply to them all due to time constraints. Please understand. Finally, thank you all for your support. The readership has been steadily increasing, and the editor says we have a good chance of advancing to the 3rd round. Thank you so much. Chapter 54. Laurent is very dedicated. The guard company was stationed on an open field outside the factory, a former defensive position for the French army against the Germans, complete with fortifications. The soldiers had erected dozens of tents and reinforced the fortifications, turning it into their base. Inside the medical tent, medics carefully treated Laurent's wounds. He had been beaten up a few days earlier in town, mistaken for a kidnapper, but only suffered minor injuries. Today, the angry worker's blow had seriously injured him. His left hand was dislocated, and after being reset, it was bandaged and in a sling around his neck, requiring at least a week to recover. His nose was broken, and with a scream, it was snapped back into place, bleeding profusely and requiring sterile cotton swabs to hold it in. After the medics left, Captain Jules, the company commander of the guard company, asked with lingering fear, "Are you alright, Major?" "No big deal." Laurent covered his nose with his healthy right hand, his voice sounding a little strange due to the congestion. "Everything is under control." "You mean?" Captain Jules looked doubtful. "That situation was also part of the plan, of course." Laurent coughed guiltily, puffing out his chest. "Only this way can we convince those capitalists that we have a problem with Charles." "I know, but..." Jules didn't continue. He noticed Laurent's shifty eyes, a sign of lying, and thought it best not to expose him now. Laurent continued to emphasize, "Only a fierce conflict, even one involving bloodshed, can convince the capitalists. This is crucial, Jules." "Yes, Major." "You're right," Jules echoed, thinking to himself, "I'll leave this to you." Jules hesitated for a moment before reporting, "The problem is that only we in the guard company know the truth. The soldiers think they are genuinely monitoring Charles, and many are unwilling to do it. They've developed resistance, and I'm worried the unit will split because of it." This was Guillerie's order, for secrecy, only as trusted confidants. Laurent and Jules knew that their ostensible surveillance was actually to protect Charles and the factory. Furthermore, Guillerie had a personal motive. He wanted to know Charles's strategic and tactical ideas and suggestions as soon as possible. Laurent glanced at Jules and asked, "Resistance?" "Yes," Jules explained, "everyone knows Charles saved France, Major, but we're monitoring him as a spy, at least on the surface. The soldiers feel this is unwelcome, even an insult to their intelligence, and therefore unwilling to carry out this mission." Laurent let out a faint, indistinct snort. "Do their thoughts matter? They only need to consider one thing, obeying orders." "But Major, gather them." Laurent interrupted Jules. "Let me deal with them." "Yes, Major," Jules replied helplessly. After Jules left, Laurent got up and looked at himself in the mirror. Although his nose was red and swollen and his lips were turned up, he still straightened his military cap. Soldiers must always pay attention to their appearance. When Laurent walked out of the tent, more than 200 soldiers from the guard company were already lined up outside. Laurent, with one arm in a sling, strode in front of them with his head held high and chest out. He tried to look fierce by widening his eyes, but little did he know that this only looked ridiculous to the soldiers. "I heard that some people have doubts about this mission. Some people think that we are monitoring a capitalist with a conscience, so it is unnecessary to waste time." Before he could finish speaking, a soldier responded, "Isn't that right, Major?" "Of course not." Laurent turned his head quickly in the direction of the voice and shouted angrily, "Have you forgotten Lesseps? Wasn't he a good man before he declared bankruptcy? Wasn't he a savior like Charles? This happened 20 years ago." French businessman Jean-François Lesseps won the rights to build the Panama Canal and issued shares domestically. With vigorous media coverage and numerous guarantees from members of parliament, the entire nation believed it was a surefire way to make money. The people went crazy, seeing Lesseps as a savior leading them to wealth. They snapped up billions of francs worth of shares issued by Lesseps, and soon after, they bought up all the newly issued shares. However, the company suddenly declared bankruptcy with debts of 1.28 billion francs, while the canal was only one-third complete. People then realized they had been deceived and discovered that almost everyone had accepted bribes from Lesseps. Government officials, high-ranking officials, over 200 members of parliament, and numerous journalists had all conspired to create this fraud, trapping the public. The leader of the Radical Party, Jean-François Clemenceau, received a staggering 1 million francs in bribes. This led to the bankruptcy of 900,000 small shareholders and the collapse of numerous small and medium-sized enterprises. Even more unacceptable was that, despite overwhelming evidence, the court acquitted them all, and Lesseps was fined a paltry 3,000 francs. The people's repeated demonstrations and strikes were all in vain. They were too naive to expect the capitalists to convict them and make them pay the price was a pipe dream. The soldiers fell silent. Laurent's words made sense. Before declaring bankruptcy, Lesab was more than just a good man, he was the hope of the French people. This was one of the reasons why the French military and civilians hated capitalists so much, and Charles was a true capitalist. Capitalists have their own agendas, Laurent continued in a hoarse voice, instinctively raising his left hand to emphasize his point, but quickly switching to his right after feeling the pain. They're all good people now that they've revealed their true colors, but they're all the same. Their essence is profit-seeking. They all want to swindle our hard-earned money from us poor folks, without exception. Some soldiers agreed, that's right, they're all up to no good, they just want to sell their technology for a good price. Others objected, Charles is different, he saved our lives, what's more valuable than our lives, more valuable than friends, he didn't have to do this. My brother was wounded in the war, and Charles saved him. Charles paid out of his own pocket and asked for nothing in return. We can't treat Charles like this. It's unclear who started it, it might have begun with spitting, accidentally landing on someone and getting punched. Others took it as provocation, and soon they were fighting. Many even threw down their rifles and rejoined the fray, yelling and screaming, unable to even discern which side they supported. Laurent watched helplessly, shouting to try and stop the soldiers' excessive behavior. Wait, stop, you, thud. In the chaos, a flying punch struck Laurent's chin, knocking him to the ground. Inside the third-floor office of the motorcycle factory, Daleka and Charles looked bewildered at the chaotic scene of soldiers outside the wall. What are they doing? Daleka asked. I don't know, Charles shook his head. Maybe it's training. They might be practicing how to deal with angry workers. Daleka nodded, feeling a surge of emotion. Laurent was a dedicated soldier, his training seemed genuine. Someone like him would surely protect Charles well. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 55 After Sale Service. It was still a medical tent. Amid Laurent's pained groans, a medic removed half a tooth from his mouth, a broken fragment hanging from his gums. Major, are you really alright? Captain Jules asked. Shouldn't we report this to the general? Are you crazy? Laurent glared. Reporting such a trivial matter to the general? He's directing the army in pursuit of the Germans, and we're wasting his precious time on this. Captain Jules looked troubled. A trivial matter? It's only the first day, and you've already been beaten twice, and it doesn't seem like it'll stop. Just then, the phone rang. Captain Jules got up, picked up the receiver, then turned to Laurent and whispered, "It's the general." Galeri felt inexplicably anxious. This damned system made him feel timid, like fighting the enemy with his hands and feet tied. At this time, although the military had received a batch of sidecar motorcycles and distributed them to the soldiers, the effect was far from satisfactory. French soldiers expected a repeat of Colonel Brownie's victory, that the Germans would flee at the side of the straitjacks, and that large numbers of Germans would fall under the Maxim machine guns. However, German losses were negligible, and not a single straitjacker returned. A barrage of negative feedback immediately reached Galeri. What the hell is this? It can't stop bullets at all, and it can't even aim at the enemy. This thing is useless. We must have been tricked. Galeri had already confirmed Major Brownie's record, so he believed the problem lay in tactics, not the straitjackers. Galeri should have called Charles in to discuss it. But the capitalists would have seen this as a conspiracy between the military and arms dealers. Recalling the experienced Major Brownie from the battlefield? This would not only affect the fighting at the front, but more importantly, Major Brownie's tactics were taught by Charles, and he might be in a state of knowing how but not why, unable to explain why he himself. Therefore, it had to be Charles. Ultimately, Galeri decided to let Laurent handle the matter. He called Laurent. "I heard you've run into some trouble. I want to discuss something with Charles, secretly. Can you manage that, as soon as possible? It's important." Laurent, with cotton stuffed in his mouth to stop the bleeding, sounded a little slurred on the other end of the line. No, it's just a minor problem, everything's under control, General. Of course, it can be done. Okay, I'll take care of it right away." After hanging up, Laurent was silent for a moment. He needed to speak with Charles, but it had to be done secretly, without anyone else knowing. How could he do it? Kidnap like last time? This time it would be more difficult and more dangerous. Those workers in the factory were not to be trifled with. Should he notify Charles that night? The general said as soon as possible, although he didn't know how long as soon as possible would take. It certainly wouldn't be until night. Well, Laurent's eyes suddenly lit up, a smug smile spreading across his face. He muttered to himself, "This little thing is no problem for me." He turned to Jules and ordered, "Bring Charles here. I want to interrogate him myself." Jules, who was drinking water, stumbled at the words, coughing twice and spitting out his water. He looked at Laurent, his eyes filled with fear. "Interrogate, yes, interrogate," Laurent said expressionlessly. "We received intelligence that the Germans are copying sidecar motorcycles. We have reason to suspect that the motorcycle factory leaked the technology. Of course, we need to bring Charles here to ask what's going on." "Are you crazy?" Jules stared at Laurent in disbelief. "The Germans have captured sidecar motorcycles before. They can copy them without Charles providing any technology." "Of course I know." Laurent looked up at Jules. "The point is that this is how we can conduct a secret discussion, but this plan will also kill us," Jules replied. Laurent interrupted Jules with a look. Jules knew what Laurent meant. "We're soldiers, Jules. Can this be more dangerous than the hail of bullets on the battlefield? Then go try it on the battlefield." Jules had no choice but to obey the order. As he turned away, he thought that as long as no one knew it was an interrogation, he could politely invite Charles in and everything would be fine. Unexpectedly, Laurent added from behind, "It's an interrogation, Jules. Tell everyone." Jules was filled with despair. He doubted whether he could even leave the factory alive. Ultimately, Jules chose a clever method. He ventured into the den of demons alone, without any guards, carrying a gift box, making it seem like he was visiting Charles. Only in this way could he avoid alerting the watchful, wary workers. When he met Charles, he clearly stated that it was an interrogation, but with a meaningful look. Joka and Charles immediately understood what was going on. Charles asked, "Should you handcuff me or something? That would make it look more like an interrogation." But this suggestion terrified Jules. "No, no, Master Charles. This is enough. Also, if you can, please keep smiling, and we can find some topics to talk about as we walk." "Is that so?" Charles was bewildered. Their usual interrogations didn't seem to be like this. Charles didn't object. He did as Captain Jules said. For some reason, as they walked out of the factory gate, Captain Jules let out a long sigh of relief. "Thank you very much, Master Charles." Captain Jules' eyes were filled with sincerity. Charles' cooperation had saved his life. Laurent's command post was simply furnished, with only a table and 2 wooden chairs. Even the lights hadn't been installed yet, and the overcast sky made the tent somewhat dim. Laurent lowered the curtain and respectfully nodded to Charles. "Master Charles, General Guerrieri wants to speak with you." "This is the only way I can do it." Charles nodded to indicate he understood. There was no need for further pleasantries. General Guerrieri was probably still waiting on the other end of the phone. After the call connected, Guerrieri quipped, "It's time for you to provide after-sales service, kid. You wouldn't want our orders turned up just like this, would you?" "Of course not, General," Charles replied, a hint of doubt in his mind. "Is there some quality problem with this sidecar? That's a British Victory brand motorcycle, historically proven in combat. Surely it shouldn't need after-sales service right after its debut?" However, Charles immediately realized it probably wasn't that kind of after-sales service. If it were, Guerrieri would have questioned him openly rather than secretly summoning him for interrogation. "Sure enough," Guerrieri replied, "I think it's because you didn't provide the instruction manual." Chapter 56 Harassment Tactics. Charles listened patiently as Guerrieri finished recounting the events, nearly bursting with exasperation. "It can't be used for frontal assaults, General," Charles exclaimed. "I guessed so," Guerrieri replied. "I've read Major Brownie's report. He used a side path to infiltrate behind the lines and catch the enemy off guard. Is that the only way to fight with a sidecar motorcycle? The battlefield has changed somewhat. Since Major Brownie's great victory, the Germans are on guard when they garrison. They dig at least 2 trenches before and after their positions. This is the principle of for every spear, there is a shield. The battlefield is a place where both sides defend against each other and risk their lives. The Germans can't just sit idly by and be slaughtered by sidecar motorcycles time and time again. Digging trenches is a good method. Sidecar motorcycles don't have the trench crossing capabilities of tracked tanks, and a small trench is enough to block their path. But the role of sidecar motorcycles isn't just about surprise attacks. Charles thought for a moment and said, "We can try harassment tactics. It might be suitable for the current situation." Harassment tactics? Galini's questioning voice came through the microphone. "Yes," Charles explained, "it's the same strategy. Bypassing the enemy lines and penetrating deep into their rear to harass their main force." Galini didn't quite understand. What if they were still on guard? And not all roads are suitable for a straightjack attack. A straightjack raid requires specific terrain. It needs at least a large open area with relatively flat terrain. Otherwise, the straightjacks will have difficulty even getting through, let alone attacking. "That's why I said harassment rather than attack," Charles explained. "We don't need many, just a few. They can pop up around the enemy and fire a few shots, day or night. They don't even need to cross the trenches," Galini said, seemingly understanding. Charles continued, "The mission of the harassing troop is to frighten the enemy, forcing them to frequently organize defenses or slow their march, or even wake up repeatedly in the middle of the night unable to sleep. After a few days, they will be exhausted. Once the enemy is off guard or a small unit is separated from the enemy, the harassing troop can concentrate its forces to launch a surprise attack." Galiri nodded slightly. He was a seasoned veteran and understood the power of this tactic. The harassing troop would be like a swarm of flies, buzzing around the enemy, impossible to catch or drive away, preventing them from eating or sleeping in peace. Meanwhile, the troop, relying on their familiarity with the terrain and their speed, would always remain outside the enemy's firing range. Even the German artillery would be helpless against such fast, small targets that could disappear into the woods at any moment. When the enemy is disoriented and on the verge of collapse, seize the opportunity to launch an attack. "Excellent idea," Galini exclaimed sincerely. "Another tactic that could potentially defeat a stronger enemy. You seem to be treating war like a game of toying with your opponents." There was a hint of regret in Galini's tone. It was a waste for a military genius like Charles to be in business. He should be an advisor, devising strategies for him, and training troops to learn these tactics. Charles cautioned, "This tactic sounds simple, but it's difficult to implement, General. Be careful not to charge blindly or launch attacks recklessly. Most importantly, have thorough intelligence on the enemy, otherwise, you're easily ambushed." He paused, then added, "Speaking of intelligence gathering, I think two-wheeled motorcycles are more suitable than three-wheeled motorcycles." "What do you think?" "Absolutely right," Galini nodded repeatedly. "Two-wheeled motorcycles can go on almost any mountain road. They can also be used for communication." Charles added fuel to the fire. "Motorcycles are much faster and more reliable than horses," Charles practically added. "Order now and get a 10% discount, dear." Galiri didn't realize Charles was making a sales pitch. His mind was filled with images of communications soldiers speeding along roads and highways on motorcycles. After a while, he exclaimed, "If you weren't only 17, I would never believe you've never fought in a war." Then Galiri felt that this wasn't quite right. No one in France who had fought in a war knew of such tactics or thought of these points. So, it had nothing to do with whether or not he had fought. Then what was it? Completely based on imagination? Unbelievable. Charles on the other end of the line simply chuckled. Galiri couldn't fathom that Charles knew advanced modern tactics, wisdom accumulated over thousands of years on the battlefield. "Any other methods?" Galiri's voice was urgent. "I think special operations are also suitable for the current situation, General," Charles said. "Special operations?" Galiri's eyes lit up again. However, just as Galiri was listening intently, a burst of static came from the other end of the line. "Release Master Charles, you capitalist lackeys. What evidence do you have to arrest him? Master Charles saved France from the Germans. How could he be a German spy? A German spy?" Galiri was completely bewildered. Which bastard did this? Accusing Charles of being a spy? Chaos reigned on the other end of the line. Angry workers thrashed around the tent holding Charles, trying to force their way in. Even Jules and his soldiers, rifles in hand, couldn't stop them. Jules loudly explained, "Gentlemen, you've misunderstood. We just want to talk to Master Charles." "Liar!" someone immediately shouted. "We know what Major Laurent said." Jules understood. Someone among the soldiers had tipped off the workers, otherwise, they wouldn't have known it was an interrogation. Jules was about to explain when Laurent stepped forward angrily. "Yes, This is interrogation, not just Charles. Every one of you is suspect." Bang! A stone flew and struck Laurent squarely on the head. Losing his balance, Laurent fell to the ground, blood trickling down his hat brim. The people, however, were not about to give up. They shouted, trying to break through the soldiers' defenses. Just then, Charles emerged from the tent and appeared before the workers. "I'm all right, gentlemen, thank you." His voice wasn't loud, but the crowd instantly fell silent. The workers were relieved to see Charles. "Did these bastards torture you?" "Don't worry, Master Charles, we'll always stand by you. Anyone could be a spy, but you couldn't be." Charles looked at Laurent, covered in wounds and being helped up by his men, and even felt a pang of pity. Chapter 57 Comrades in Arms. Harassment tactics proved highly successful on the battlefield, given that the primary means of transportation at that time were horses, mules, and dogs. During World War I in Europe, dogs were often used to pull machine guns and ammunition to reduce manpower burdens. In this context, Charles developed a harassment tactic using sidecars and motorcycles, effectively dismantling the German army on a mobility level. While it didn't cause direct casualties, it reduced the German army's marching efficiency and combat effectiveness, while simultaneously strengthening the French army's communication and intelligence capabilities. This indirect damage to the German army was immeasurable. The direct impact of the tactic's success was substantial profits for Charles. He received numerous orders from the military, an initial order of 3,000 sidecars, followed by another 3,000, and an initial order of 5,000 motorcycles. The profit per sidecar was 280 francs, and per motorcycle 180 francs. The military procurement price for motorcycles was 360 francs. Preliminary estimates suggest that the initial order from the French military alone yielded a profit of 2.58 million francs. Soon, the motorcycle factory received orders from the British Army, and even from Russia, on the other side of the world. Russia's idea was to buy a batch for trial use. If it adapted to their terrain, they hoped to open a branch factory in Russia for mass production. Charles was very confident. The Russian army's communication problems were extremely backward, affecting the coordination of various units and becoming a weakness in combat effectiveness. The addition of motorcycles could, to some extent, compensate for this deficiency. While Charles was thriving, Francis felt immense pressure. At Francis's private villa, he was having dinner with his family by candlelight. Dinner consisted of steak, and the family members, with napkins around their necks, silently ate their food. The table, which should have been filled with laughter and conversation, became somewhat awkward because of Francis's silence. Just as everyone was secretly wondering what was happening, Francis asked in a muffled voice, "Do you know Joseph resigned?" Pierre paused in his work. He knew this was directed at him. "I know, father," Pierre replied. "Do you know where he went?" Francis asked again. Pierre hesitated, then replied with a slightly embarrassed expression, "No, I don't know." "And Thomas, do you know where he went?" Francis asked again. Pierre shook his head slightly. He realized this wasn't a question, but a reproach. Sure enough, the next second Francis looked up at Pierre, his voice low with anger. "Joseph, Thomas, Victor, Parrot, a total of 77 people. These best technical employees have resigned for over half a month, and you know nothing about it?" Before Pierre could answer, Francis gave the answer. "They all went to Charles's newly opened tractor factory, Pierre, and you don't even know that Charles built a tractor factory next to the motorcycle factory and imported the whole 75 from England." Pierre looked up at Francis in shock. He truly knew nothing about it. As the eldest son, he was more concerned about which young and beautiful dancer had recently arrived at Folie Trevis in the 9th arrondissement of Paris. Note, Folie Trevis is the hottest nightclub in Paris. Francis cut off a piece of beef and forked it into his mouth, chewing vigorously as he said, "That motorcycle factory we considered worthless has become a golden goose in Charles's hands in less than a month. His orders are said to be booked all year round. 3 batches of workers are working day and night, increasing production several times over, yet demand still can't keep up. Now he's opened a tractor factory, with tractors a generation more advanced than ours." Francis stopped what he was doing and glared at Pierre, his tone full of sarcasm. "And what have you done, Pierre? Have your womanizing skills improved, or have your bedroom skills gotten even better?" Sitting next to Pierre, Amber unconsciously lowered her head. She was Pierre's wife. She knew about Pierre's affairs but never questioned them. She believed that as long as she lived her own life well, what Pierre did outside was none of her business. Frances was even more furious seeing this. He believed that Amber should control her husband. Her indulgence was one of the reasons why Pierre was so unable to extricate himself from his sensual pleasures. Pierre, however, remained calm and composed. He seemed used to Frances's tone, so no matter how angry Frances was, he continued cutting his steak and elegantly putting it into his mouth. "Aren't you going to think of a solution?" Frances looked at Pierre with exasperation. "If you can't solve this problem, your good days are numbered, Pierre." Pierre knew what this meant. His extravagant lifestyle came from the tractor factory. If Charles eliminated the tractor factory, his source of income would be cut off. "I don't understand one thing, father," Pierre replied calmly. "Since Charles has already sold the industrial rights to the tanks, why is he still running a tractor factory? Is it just to eliminate us from the market? This didn't make sense. Charles should know that civilian tractors weren't selling, and the rights to convert military tractors into tanks were in Grevy's hands and produced by Frances's tractor factory. So, who would Charles sell his tractors to?" Frances scoffed. "You think Charles would do something that loses money? That kid's nothing like his father. His head is full of brilliant ideas. If he can come up with the first tank and the sidecar, he can come up with the second. Once he succeeds, we're finished." Pierre nodded. He had underestimated Charles after all. This kid was indeed formidable. He planned to completely crush Frances's tractor factory in both civilian and military applications. "He's almost succeeded," Pierre said. What a pity," Frances retorted. "Do you have a way to deal with him?" Frances thought the situation was settled. He had focused solely on tank production, completely neglecting Charles's actions, which allowed Charles to gain an advantage over his tractor factory in terms of technology, workers, and capital. Unbelievable. In less than a month, his decades of hard work were about to be wasted. How did this kid manage that? But Pierre disagreed. He reminded him, "The tank's ownership is in Grevy's hands, father." So, Frances suddenly realized that he had been so caught up in the situation that he had forgotten this point. Charles's actions would affect Grevy's interests, meaning that the nobles like Grevy had become comrades in arms on the same side as him. After thinking for a moment, Frances nodded and said, "That makes sense." Then he raised his glass to Pierre, who calmly responded. Chapter 58, What's there to be afraid of in a 17-year-old? Armand's Bled estate, only 3 kilometers from Paris, became a gathering place for the Tank Alliance due to its convenient location. Unlike before, this time it was Frances who convened the others. Nicholas was reluctant to come, his excuse being that the tank business was irrelevant to him. His job was simply to receive payment and spread the word through Le Figaro, and he didn't need to attend any meetings. The real reason was that Nicholas didn't consider Frances a nobleman. In Nicholas's eyes, Frances was just a tractor seller, and Nicholas didn't need to waste his time on such a person. But soon Grevy called Nicholas. "Frances thinks you should be there, Mr. Nicholas." "Oh, what important thing could it be?" Nicholas laughed. "Who knows? But if he insists, all right, I'll be there. But I might leave early." "He'd better keep it short." Nicholas's tone was full of contempt for Frances. When Nikolai arrived at the manor, everyone else was already there. He didn't apologize, but instead, looking travel-worn, handed his cane and hat to servants and sat down on the sofa without even taking off his coat. "Gentlemen," he said, "I can only stay a little while. I have an appointment with Mr. Abel in an hour. It won't take up too much of your time, Mr. Nikolai." Frances nodded to Nikolai. Nikolai was quite surprised by Frances's confident demeanor. Usually, he was always submissive, as if bowing his head, but now he had the air of a host. Nikolai glanced questioningly at Armand and Grevy, who simply responded with smiles. "It's like this," Frances said. "I recently learned that Charles built a tractor factory next to his motorcycle factory." A few seconds of silence filled the living room, then laughter suddenly broke the silence. Armand handed Nikolai a glass of red wine and said, "As far as I know, Charles is your grandson, Mr. Francis. Are you planning to have Mr. Nikolai advertise for your grandson's new factory?" Nikolai's lips curled into a sneer, but he humbly replied, "It would be my pleasure to serve you, Mr. Francis." His exaggerated behavior once again drew laughter from the others. Francis ignored their jeers, simply emphasizing, "A tractor factory, gentlemen, and a more advanced Holt 75 than mine. It boasts 83 horsepower and a top speed of 24 kilometers per hour, while my tractor only has 61 horsepower and a top speed of 15 kilometers per hour. What do you think?" Armand didn't take it seriously, continuing to drink his wine without a care. Nikolai's smile turned to helplessness. He wondered if Francis was taking the advertisement seriously. Only Greavy's smile faded. "You mean, Charles intends to compete with you?" Greavy asked. "He's competing with us, gentlemen," Francis corrected. "If Charles modifies the Hort 75 tank, it will undoubtedly have a higher speed and greater payload than the Hort 60. Which do you think the military would prefer?" The others then realized the seriousness of the matter and understood they had misunderstood. Charles, in Francis's words, wasn't a pushover, but a competitor. Armand hesitated for a moment, then shrugged indifferently. What can he do? "The tank industry's intellectual property rights are in our hands." "Yes," Nikolai said, "we still have a say." That was the newspaper's advantage. If Charles dared to infringe on their industrial property rights, he would immediately face attacks from public opinion and the law, even if he was the inventor. Greavy didn't speak. He seemed to have already guessed where the problem lay. "Sure enough," Francis smiled and shook his head, "you underestimate Charles. If it were really as you think, he wouldn't have built this tractor factory." "Tell me about his abilities," Armand said with disdain. "Do you think we should be afraid of a 17-year-old? Francis was speechless for a moment. He glanced at Armand incredulously. What a fool. He was a party leader and a member of parliament. These words, of course, could not be spoken aloud. Francis leaned back on the sofa, took a deep breath to relax, and said slowly, "Gentlemen, I have a story to tell. The German First Army originally marched on Paris. It only needed to encircle Paris from the west, and Paris would be finished. However, I purchased food in machine gun factories, and told Guerrieri that I would provide supplies to the French Fifth Army free of charge. The French Fifth Army therefore changed its retreat route and assembled in Darvest. The German First Army, following the French Fifth Army, changed its marching direction, thus exposing its flank to Paris." Armand interrupted Francis with a smile. "Are you saying that you are the savior of Paris?" "No, Mr. Armand." Francis sat up straight, staring at Armand, and answered word by word, "Charles is the savior. He is the savior of Paris. Charles made me do all of this." The crowd exchanged bewildered glances. They had never known there was such a story behind it, or rather, it wasn't a story at all. Because the protagonist of the story is Charles, and Charles is Francis's enemy, Francis wouldn't boast about his enemy, so this story is very likely true. Greavy seemed to realize something, and he looked at Francis in shock. So, Charles had already modified tractors into tanks and was waiting for the Germans in La Vasse. Francis nodded. Not only that, he also trained a squad of soldiers to use tanks and led this force to defeat the Germans. Everyone present was astonished. They had always thought these were just rumors. The official propaganda was that Major Brownie trained the troops and led his men to defeat the Germans. Charles was merely the inventor of the tank. Francis added, "I saw it with my own eyes. Major Brownie was just doing what Charles said, and I think the same thing happened in the Battle of the Sidewalk." Unbelievable. Greavy unconsciously stood up. Charles was just a 17-year-old boy, yet he possessed such strategy, such shrewdness, and those astonishing inventions. How did he do it? Greavy had always known that Charles was outstanding, but he hadn't expected him to be this outstanding. It far exceeded his imagination. He muttered to himself, "If Charles is an opponent, he's a terrifying one." This was exactly what Francis wanted to say. "Now, do you understand what kind of enemy you're facing? Do you still think he's just a 17-year-old kid with nothing to fear?" Before anyone could answer, Francis continued, "Tank intellectual property is nothing to him. Gentlemen, if I'm not mistaken, he'll soon develop a new tank based on the Holt 75. This tank will likely bypass all industrial intellectual property, and might even be a completely new tank. Whatever it is, it will certainly be far more advanced than ours." Greavy nodded slightly. "Then, our tanks will be obsolete, and we might not be able to sell a single one." Armand sat blankly on the sofa. He considered the consequences. Losing money was a minor matter. If things really developed like this, the right wing's plan to increase its influence and control in the military would undoubtedly be shattered. Chapter 59. The Helpgalini. It was an ordinary morning, and Charles woke up naturally. He peeked out the curtains. The weather seemed rather gloomy, with a light drizzle. After a moment of bewilderment, he quickly washed up, changed his clothes, and went downstairs. Camille was busy in the kitchen. Seeing Charles, she brought him a large plate of apple tarts and a cup of hot milk. "You must finish it all." Camille's tone left no room for argument. In French, breakfast also means small meal, indicating that the French don't value breakfast much. A quick bite is enough, and sometimes they skip it altogether. But Camille believed Charles was growing and needed to eat more. "Where's father?" Charles asked, munching on a crisp apple tart. "Hasn't he gotten up yet?" Usually, Djoka would have breakfast with Charles at this time and then drive to work. Charles was worried that he would be stuck at home all day again, like last time. "He just went out." Camille poked her head out of the kitchen, her eyes gleaming with pride. "He went to buy a newspaper." He heard her in the news again. Charles didn't think much of it. Ever since he invented the tank and the sidecar, newspapers big and small in Paris had been reporting on Charles's story. Le Petit Le Chateaux, Le Petit Paris, Le Journal, and others, one article after another, tirelessly. Reporters would often wait for Charles at his doorstep or factory, demanding interviews and photographs. Note, the above four newspapers were the four major popular newspapers in France at the time, with Le Petit Le Chateaux having the highest circulation. Charles had gotten used to it. At first, he would deal with it. After all, those reporters were just trying to make a living. Soon, however, he grew tired of it, thinking it was a waste of time and endless. But Djoka and Camille were thoroughly enjoying it. Whenever a newspaper published Charles's story, they would buy it, read it repeatedly, then critique and discuss it, even comparing it to similar stories, and finally collect them all. Just then, Djoka returned. Camille saw Djoka through the window and rushed to the door, excitedly shouting, "Is it true? Another report from Charles? What's it about this time?" Djoka simply nodded, entered, and casually handed a newspaper to Camille before sitting down in front of Charles without a word. Charles noticed the worry in Djoka's eyes and couldn't help but ask, "The newspaper wrote something bad about me?" "No." Djoka shook his head slightly, still saying nothing. Camille unfolded the newspaper, pacing back and forth as he read, then excitedly exclaimed, "This time it's Le Figaro, and it's on the front page." "They say you..." Camille suddenly looked at Charles in surprise, new content. "They say you intentionally led the Germans to Davos, exposing their flanks, which is how we defeated them. Is it true, Charles? Why have you never told me this before?" Charles instantly understood why Djoka had that expression. Djoka gave Charles a wink, and Charles understood immediately. He put on an innocent expression and replied, "I don't know anything about this, Mom. They just made it up." Camille paused, then laughed. "These reporters will say anything to boost sales, but it's a good thing, isn't it?" She put the newspaper on the table and went back into the kitchen. "It really is a good thing. Our Charles is a hero again." Djoka looked bitter and lowered his voice to ask Charles, "Was it Francis?" Charles nodded. Only 3 people knew about this, Francis, Galini, and Djoka. Galini and Djoka couldn't have leaked the information, so it had to be Francis. Djoka had actually guessed it too, but he didn't want to admit it. After all, it was his father, Charles's grandfather. "This might have something to do with our new tractor factory," Charles said. He hoped to give a reason so that Djoka would feel better. Even so, can he really do that? Djoka suddenly became agitated, tapping the newspaper hard with his finger, his voice almost squeezed out through clenched teeth. "He's praising you on the surface, portraying you as a hero, but his real intention is to send you into the army so you won't become his rival." Charles didn't deny it. That was Francis's intention. "He's a coward," Djoka muttered. "He's afraid to face your challenge, resorting to such underhanded methods. Doesn't he worry about you going to the battlefield?" Djoka stopped himself from saying the rest, considering it unlucky. Charles didn't know how to comfort Djoka. He could only say, "It might not just be him." "Father, what?" Djoka looked at Charles, puzzled. Charles reminded him, "Le Figaro." Djoka said oh, and understood. Le Figaro was a newspaper targeting the nobility, and its owner, Nicolas, was a member of the nobility, along with the Gravy and Armand, who were traditional noble representatives and party leaders. And the tank ownership had been sold to them. If Charles's tractors developed successfully, they could threaten or even replace tank sales. Connecting all these factors, things become clear. Djoka's anger gradually turned to fear. Although they don't have much political influence, their connections are deeply entrenched, giving them considerable power. They also have a voice in the House of Representatives, and they're incredibly wealthy. At this moment, Camille came out, placing a plate of apple tarts in front of both Djoka and herself, and asked curiously, "What are you talking about?" Djoka was somewhat flustered. If Camille knew that Francis and the traditional aristocracy had joined forces against Charles, she would be terrified. Charles calmly replied, "Nothing, Mom. The car just had a minor problem." Camille didn't doubt him at all. She smiled and glanced at Joka. "That's your father's prized possession, Charles." No wonder he looked so grim. Charles smiled but didn't speak. This was unexpected for Charles. He had always tried to avoid escalating conflicts with capitalists, but ultimately, he had offended the traditional aristocracy. At the same time, he found it amusing. The traditional nobility seemed to have done Gallieni a favor. Previously, Gallieni had always hoped that Charles would become a military advisor, but he dared not openly request him due to Charles's status as an arms dealer, and even had to avoid any appearance of impropriety when discussing matters. Now, with the traditional nobility pushing him along, Gallieni could easily realize his wish, and Laurent wouldn't have to go through all that trouble to demean himself. No, that old man Gallieni, he would act extremely unwilling, only reluctantly accepting in the end. That drama queen, that old fox. It's your time to put on a show again. Chapter 60. Sorry everyone, there was an error. The French Parliament is divided into the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. The Chamber of Deputies, located in the Palais Bourbon, has greater power, while the Senate, located in the Luxembourg Palace, has less power. I confused the two, thinking the Senate had more power, and thus some chapters used Senate instead of Senate. I will gradually correct the use of Senate to Chairman of Deputies in the earlier text, but Senate will appear again later. This may cause confusion for readers, so please bear with me. Chapter 61 is all traps. In the Palais Bourbon, Gallieni stood quietly on the podium, awaiting questioning from members of Parliament. The parliamentary questioning system was established in 1869. The French Constitution stipulates that any member of Parliament may consider it their right to ask a minister or any official a question. The latter has the right to take what they deem appropriate, to answer or not to answer. This is considered a means for Parliament to oversee the government's work. Those being questioned have virtually no right to not answer, otherwise they might lose their positions, just as you have the right to remain silent during a job interview, but the employer has the right not to hire you. Gallieni might be an exception. As a powerful general who turned the tide of the war, he could easily ignore the members' questions. No one dared or could dismiss him. Even mentioning retirement would terrify the members. But Gallieni accepted the questioning. He explained it this way: those disgusting journalists turned hearsay into news. They think a 17-year-old can easily control the war situation. Is war a game? Or a child's toy? This is an insult to soldiers, to the army, to the martyrs. I will not allow this to happen, never. Armand and Grevy remained seated, asking no questions. They didn't want others to immediately see through their organization. The first to ask questions were the impatient members of Parliament, both left and right. Having read the newspapers, their curiosity led them to ask pointless questions they knew they wouldn't get answers to. General Gallieni, is what the newspapers say true? Did the German First Army really expose its flank because of Charles? Shouldn't that be asked of Charles himself? Gallieni scoffed. Francis's purchase of grain and machine gun factories is undeniable, isn't it? Of course, so some people are linking this to the Germans turning against their country. You have quite the imagination. Charles did invent the tank, that's true. What does that prove? Do we owe him? No, we paid him. Galen's answer was impeccable. While the events were true, it couldn't prove that Charles intentionally led the Germans to Davos. Gallieni's attitude was clear: if you don't believe me, ask Charles. If the parties involved deny it, then it didn't happen. Armand could no longer contain himself. He rose, half raising his right hand to indicate he wanted to speak. He took a small step forward and calmly asked Gallieni on the platform, "General, I only care about one thing. Should we let someone as talented as Charles join the army? This might save many lives and even rescue France from its peril. This is Armand's brilliance." He immediately places himself on the moral high ground, guiding everyone to consider saving lives and saving France. If Gallieni denies it, he's ignoring the lives of soldiers on the front lines and the safety of France. If he admits it, Charles should join the army. What Armand doesn't know is that Gallieni also wants Charles to join the army. He's just trying to avoid sending Charles to the front as an ordinary soldier. His apparent insistence on excluding Charles is actually a bargaining tactic. Oh, really? Gallieni lowers his head to meet Armand's gaze. We need a 17-year-old to save us? I think you should replace all the soldiers on the front lines with teenagers, and we can hide in the rear, drinking coffee, reading newspapers, and waiting for their good news. Sir, the members of Parliament are amused by Gallieni's sarcasm. Armand's face unconsciously shows some embarrassment. He realizes Gerlini is not easy to deal with. Armand replies, "No, General, we're discussing special cases. I wouldn't ask other underage children to join the army. Charles is exceptional. We all know he possesses extraordinary military talent, whether it's inventing equipment or anything else. I think many people, like me, don't want to see him buried in obscurity, and the country desperately needs talent like him." This immediately resonated with many members of parliament. Even if the rumors were unreliable, it was true that Charles had invented equipment to defeat the Germans, and not just once, which meant it wasn't a coincidence. "Your idea is novel, sir," Galleri retorted without hesitation. "You're sending a capitalist who should be inventing tanks and sidecars for us in the rear to carry a rifle to the battlefield, and calling it avoiding the burying of talent? Yes, you don't want to bury talent, you just want to bury him." The members of parliament burst into laughter again. Armand was speechless, because Charles invented tanks and sidecars in factories, not on the battlefield. "I think I need to remind you," Galen added, "only in factories can you access tractors and motorcycles, and only then do you have the time, space, and resources to convert them into tanks and sidecars. In the army, you only need to think about 3 things: eating, sleeping, and waiting to die." No, we can create a similar environment for Charles. Unfortunately, there isn't such an environment in the army, but I would be happy to invite you to try. We can have Charles as a staff officer at headquarters. You may not know, battlefield headquarters often receive artillery shells from the enemy, sir. Then don't send him to the battlefield. You mean, for Charles alone, we should leave an entire army group as a mere decoration in the rear? The members of parliament laughed even louder. Although Armand was eloquent, his ignorance of the military put him at a complete disadvantage in this debate. At this moment, Grevy stood up, not facing Galleri on the podium but turning to the members of parliament behind him. "Why don't we have Charles serve as a staff officer under General Galleri? General Galleri is the commander of Paris's defenses. Charles is safe with him. This way, Charles can advise the army while also overseeing his factory in Darvest." The proposal immediately received the support of the councillors. "Excellent idea. That's right. Paris is safe. This way, Charles can continue his inventions." Galleri remained outwardly calm, but inwardly he was overjoyed. These bastards had finally fallen into his trap. Armand looked at Grevy with a strange expression. This wasn't their plan. Their goal was to send Charles to a dangerous place. But Grevy shook his head slightly at Armand. Armand suddenly understood Grevy's meaning. If the goal of sending Charles to a dangerous place couldn't be achieved, they should settle for sending him to the army first. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 62 Thinkers. The meeting continued into the afternoon, except for a 1-hour lunch break. The left and right wings were constantly arguing, though few issues were raised and none were particularly important. Leaving the House of Representatives, gazing at the setting sun through the thin mist, Grevy and Armand greedily inhaled the fresh air. Armand, a victorious smile on his face, turned and asked, "What are your plans now?" Grevy remained expressionless. He didn't consider sending Charles to Gerlini a significant victory, even though it was indeed the military. After all, Charles could still manage the factory while in the military, meaning he was still their competitor. After a moment's hesitation, Grevy thoughtfully said, "I think I should talk to Charles." Armand looked at Grevy in surprise. "You don't actually want to recruit him to our side, do you?" "You can't do that. He's a capitalist. Francis is a capitalist too," Grevy replied. "Besides, it wouldn't cost us anything. More importantly, it was Charles's talent that Grevy felt was worth trying even with a 1% chance. Otherwise, he wouldn't even bother giving him a second glance." "All right," Armand replied helplessly, "wait for your good news. I'm not too keen on dealing with a child." Grevy didn't speak, but waved his hand, and the coachman pulled the carriage to a stop in front of him. Grevy opened the door, bent down, and sat down, coldly stating his destination, the motorcycle factory. "Yes, sir." The coachman flicked the reins, and the carriage turned around in front of the square, heading towards Lavas. Grevy's carriage was stopped outside the factory, which surprised him. Grevy peeked out and saw several heavily armed French soldiers standing outside the factory gate. An officer with 4 gold stripes on his sleeve walked up to the carriage and politely asked, Your identification, sir. Greevy took out his identification from his pocket and handed it over. Greevy was a nobleman and a member of Parliament, which was clearly stated on his identification, and he was confident he would be allowed to pass. To his surprise, the officer glanced at his identification and coldly said, "Sorry, sir, I cannot let you through. Please leave." Greevy frowned, but his aristocratic manners allowed him to suppress his anger. He explained in a cold voice, "I know Mr. Charles, and I would like to speak with him." "Sorry." The officer handed the identification back to Greevy. "This is a restricted industrial area. We have orders that no one unrelated to the factory is allowed to enter or leave at will." Greevy seemed to understand. The military was worried about equipment leaks. What he didn't know was that this was actually Laurent's special attention to them, the nobles. Gallery also guessed that Francis had joined forces with the traditional nobles to deal with Charles. If Dejoka could guess, Gallery certainly could. He immediately ordered Laurent not to allow any nobles to approach. They were the primary targets of surveillance. Moreover, it wasn't just the factory. A troop was also stationed and patrolled in the town of Lavas, and checkpoints were set up on the road between the town and the factory, ostensibly to check for spies, but in reality to protect Charles's safety. Greevy grunted in acknowledgement, maintaining his composure, and instructed the coachman to pull the carriage over to the side of the road next to the factory. Unexpectedly, Laurent came to shoo them away again as soon as they stopped. "Excuse me, sir, please leave." This time, Greevy couldn't hold back any longer. He replied sternly, "You have no right to kick me out, Major." No one. Greevy held a seat in the House of Representatives. He didn't believe this small factory couldn't provide a place for him. "Excuse me, sir," Laurent replied. "If I suspected you of spying on the production of military equipment here, would you think I had no right to do so?" Greevy was momentarily speechless. As a congressman, being suspected of being a spy by the military would be a devastating blow to his political career. Just then, a car slowly drove out of the factory. Greevy noticed Charles in the back seat and quickly jumped off the carriage, walking onto the road to stop the car. "Mr. Dejoka, I am Greevy, the buyer of the property rights. I would like to speak with Charles." The coachman in the back watched all this in shock. Greevy, of such status, actually stopped someone's carriage to seek a talk, if word got out. But Greevy didn't care. He looked at Charles, his eyes even showing a hint of pleading. Laurent, on the other hand, gripped his waist warily, ready to draw his gun. He knew the nobleman posed a threat to Charles, and he couldn't let Charles be in danger. Dejoka recognized Greevy and immediately refused. "No, there's nothing to talk about." "Wait, Mr. Dejoka." Greevy turned to Charles. "It will only take a few minutes." Charles nodded and said to Dejoka, who had turned back, "Don't worry, father. Everything will be all right." Greevy wasn't that foolish. As a member of Parliament, he wouldn't harm Charles under these circumstances. Charles stepped out of the carriage, and Greevy breathed a sigh of relief and expressed his gratitude. He led Charles along the open ground towards the Marne River, not far from the factory, where traces of blood from the battle between the German and French armies still lingered. Dejoka followed in his car, while Laurent, accompanied by a group of guards, trailed nervously behind. Greevy glanced back and smiled, saying, "They're protecting you very well. I produce sidecars for them," Charles explained. "They don't want any problems with production." Greevy nodded. That explanation made sense. "You only wanted to talk to me about this?" Charles asked. "No, of course not." Greevy stopped, looked up at the Marne River, and said thoughtfully, "You're a smart man, Charles. I believe you see further, more clearly, and understand more deeply. Am I wrong?" "What do you mean?" Charles didn't understand. Greevy turned his gaze to the overgrown clearing by the river and said, "This used to be fertile land, planted with potatoes, but in just a few years it became like this. Do you know why?" Charles glanced at the rows of factory buildings behind him and replied, "You mean factories?" Greevy nodded slightly. After factories appeared, vast tracts of land became factory buildings, farmers became workers, and capitalists bought up land by land. What will this country become? One day, capitalists will control all the land and the fate of everyone. With just a word from them, workers will be unemployed, impoverished, or even starving. Isn't this another form of control? Is this what capitalists call human rights and freedom? They say you're a capitalist with a conscience, Charles. You don't want it turned like this, do you? Charles suddenly understood what Greevy meant by higher, further, and clearer thinkers. France seems to have quite a few: Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau. Chapter 63 Conscription Order. After speaking with Greville, Charles realized he had a flawed understanding of the traditional aristocracy of this era. He had always assumed they operated like feudal nobles, exercising top-down authoritarian rule. However, the modern traditional aristocracy had changed with the times. They still supported elections, but opposed industrialization. The traditional aristocracy's base was the peasantry, from whom they earned income through land rent or grain taxes. Capitalists, however, built factories, transforming peasants into workers, depriving the traditional aristocracy of their base and gradually eliminating their economic source. Therefore, the struggle between the left and right was essentially a struggle between the wealthy and the workers and peasants. Left-wing capitalists shouted to the peasants, "Come on, become workers, I'll pay you wages." Right-wing nobles shouted to the peasants, "Continue to be peasants, I'll give you a better life." The nobles did indeed make changes, offering peasants more favorable conditions and encouraging production. As for the workers, the nobles considered them deceived and misled by the capitalists. Capitalists treat workers like sheep being fattened, repeatedly fleecing them before finally slaughtering them. From beginning to end, capitalists exploit workers' blood, sweat, and value. If a country continues down this path, it will inevitably face a crisis and even perish. Therefore, the traditional aristocracy hoped to establish an agricultural society where industry was merely supplementary and entirely controlled by the government. This would involve organized, orderly, and planned production, instead of the current cutthroat competition. Greville knew that to persuade Charles to join them, he had to change Charles's capitalist stance, hence his grand pronouncements. However, this was destined to be futile. Charles knew industrialization was inevitable, knew the aristocracy would eventually be marginalized, and knew that becoming an industrialized nation was the inevitable trend. No amount of struggle would change anything. "You're wasting your time, Greville," Charles said bluntly. Since the two were destined to be enemies, there should be no room for illusion. But Greville persisted. "What do you want, Charles? A powerful nation? Look at Germany, so powerful under an imperial system, while we, a republic, were utterly defeated. We can do the same. With your talent, plus the financial, human, and material resources of the right wing." One day, Charles shook his head, saying nothing. A thinker like Greville could construct a clear blueprint from a national perspective. Even if that blueprint was flawed, it was undoubtedly the result of deep thought and repeated verification. At this moment, he firmly believed his ideas were correct. Trying to persuade such a person was a futile and meaningless endeavor. "All right," Greville helplessly spread his hands towards Charles, "although you don't agree with my views, if one day you're willing to join us, you're always welcome." Greville was being polite. In truth, he had already seen something in Charles's eyes. This young man didn't believe in the world he described at all, and was more certain than anyone else, as if he knew exactly how the future would unfold. Charles looked at Greville with pity and sympathy for someone struggling in ignorance, someone who wanted to know the truth but was going in the wrong direction. Greville understood, was deeply hurt, and even began to doubt everything he firmly believed. Why was this happening? Could a 17-year-old really see things more clearly than him? Greville couldn't believe it. He watched Charles's departing figure, watched him get into the car, and muttered to himself, "No, he's just blinded by money. One day he'll understand." As the Joker turned the car around, he glanced at Greville, who was standing there in a daze, and asked, "What did he talk to you about?" Charles answered irrelevantly, "He's a man of faith, father. He has his own ideals." The Joker raised an eyebrow non-committally. Nobles with ideals and faith were rare. On the way back, Charles felt that Greville had reminded him. If traditional nobles and emerging capitalists were natural enemies, their struggle for the peasants and workers was irreconcilable. So, according to the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, shouldn't Charles find one or more emerging capitalists to befriend? That way, Charles wouldn't have to face the retaliation of the traditional aristocracy alone. After all, with his current strength, he might not be able to contend with the two major parties of the traditional aristocracy. But who should he befriend? Charles had no clue. Before they knew it, they were home. Djoka parked the car at the door, and to their surprise, Camille wasn't waiting for them. Usually, she would be sitting in front of the door at this time, knitting and staring in the direction of the factory, smiling and waving as she saw their car approaching. Puzzled, the two hurried into the house and opened the door. Camille sat blankly at the dining table, pale-faced, seemingly incapable of thought, holding a piece of paper in her hand. Charles immediately knew what had happened. It was a conscription order. Gallieni acted quickly. It hadn't been long, and the conscription order had already arrived at their home. Camille was a bit slow to react. Realizing the two had returned, she jumped up and rushed towards Joka, stammering, "Joka, take me to the conscription office. They must have made a mistake. They sent Charles a conscription order. Charles is only 17. They won't listen to that. We have to go to the conscription office right now." Joka didn't move, and neither did Charles. They knew what was going on. Going to the conscription office was pointless. Camille looked at them suspiciously, a vague feeling that there was something she didn't know. Joka hesitated for a moment, still not telling Camille the truth. "It's because of Charles's military talent, Camille. They believe Charles will be of great help in this war, so they drafted him into the army ahead of schedule," Camille retorted angrily. "Sending Charles to the battlefield just for that? Those are all unverified rumors, all made up by reporters." Charles took the draft letter and looked at it, comforting her. "It's just to Paris, mother, not to the battlefield. It says I'll report directly to General Gallieni. He'll take care of me." Joka nodded heavily, confidently saying, "Nothing will happen, I promise. Paris is safe. It's right next to Lavazzi." Actually, Joka wasn't sure. He wasn't worried about the battlefield, but about the traditional nobles. Since the traditional nobles had sent Charles into the army, they wouldn't let it go easily. Although Charles was intelligent and had military talent, he was inexperienced and lacked social experience. And those old foxes of the traditional nobles were secretly scheming, he feared. Chapter 64 New recruits report for duty. The next morning, just as dawn was breaking, Laurent was already waiting in his car downstairs at Charles's house. He had been ordered to pick Charles up for his new assignment. This was an unprecedentedly high-level reception. A major was being sent to pick up a new recruit, and the order came personally from the city's defense commander, Gallieni. Gallieni, of course, had his explanation. Laurent has always been in charge of the motorcycle factory's secrecy. "I can't allow these capitalists any opportunity to leak industrial secrets. So, Laurent will be with him from now on, wherever he goes." His true intention was obvious: to prevent any security loopholes that would give the traditional aristocracy an opportunity to exploit. Did Joka help Charles load his luggage into the car, and Camille looked at Charles with reluctance, as if Charles wasn't going to Paris, a dozen kilometers away, but to England, across the Channel. Note, the French call the English Channel the Le Manche Strait. "Thanks to Armand Capet for reminding us. Don't worry, Mom," Charles comforted her. "I can come back any time. I heard they'll give me the freedom to take care of the factory." Parliament's decisions sometimes spread quickly. Before the military even gave the order, the news had already reached Charles. Camille nodded silently. Although Joka and Charles both said everything was fine, she still felt something was amiss. Perhaps it was a mother's intuition. Unbeknownst to her, more people gathered around. They had come to see Charles off. "Young Master Charles, take this croissant with you on the way. Poor child, only 17 and already a soldier. Take good care of yourself, child." Some even cursed the capitalists, those despicable capitalists. They won't send their own children to the army, but they demand Charles join. Charles is not even a minor. While their children are indulging in debauchery, they don't care about any of this. They only know how to exploit us. Charles, from the back of the crowd, Matthew, leaning on two canes, came step by step. His face was still pale, but a confident smile played on his lips. "Matthew," Charles looked at him in surprise. "I didn't know you could get out of bed." "Of course." Matthew tilted his head casually. "It's just a minor injury. I'm recovering very well." After Matthew got closer, he stood on one leg to steady himself, rested his cane on his body, reached out and straightened Charles's collar, and said gratefully, "Thanks to you, Charles. You're not the kind of person who would say such a thing." Charles replied with a smile. "People change." Matthew smiled sadly. "Like before, I thought I was going to join the army, imagining you coming to see me off, but it was you who went to join the army." "It's okay." Charles knew he was thinking about his amputated leg again. Matthew nodded silently, a hint of melancholy in his eyes. Before coming, he had resolved to appear strong, but he always seemed to lose control. "See you soon. See you soon." Charles hugged a few people, said goodbye to Camille, and then got into the car. With a rumble of the engine, Charles waved goodbye to his family and friends behind him. Further and further away, His eyes involuntarily welled up with tears. It was strange, it was only a dozen kilometers away, Charles could go home every day, yet he still felt sad. Charles remembered a story he had read about lion cubs in a book. How the mother lion would painfully drive them out of the nest when they reached adulthood so they could survive independently. Although Charles wasn't driven out, he seemed to be going through the same process. Charles suddenly felt a pang of loneliness and fear. He didn't know what awaited him ahead. Unbeknownst to him, on a high point of a villa by the roadside, Francis stood in his pajamas, silently smoking his pipe, his face expressionless as he watched the cars pass by and recede into the distance. He hesitated for a moment before returning inside to make a phone call. "Yes, he's gone to Paris. I heard his tractor factory is already producing new tanks, and the progress is rapid. We should prepare as soon as possible." Hanging up the phone, Francis sat alone in a chair, lost in thought. Deep down, there seemed to be a lingering reluctance, a hint of hesitation. But only for a moment. His eyes turned cold, and he gritted his teeth, muttering to himself, "You forced me to do this. You wanted to destroy everything I had, so you'll pay the price." Paris City Defense Command. The command was located next to the police station in the 4th arrondissement of Paris. The reason for this location was that it could simultaneously command the army and the police, one for external defense, the other for internal security, both under the responsibility of Guerrieri. However, this was only one reason. The 4th arrondissement of Paris also housed the city hall necessary for the normal functioning of the city, hospitals urgently needed in wartime, and the Seine River flowing through it, containing 2 easily defensible islands. Guerrieri set up his headquarters there, prepared for the fall of Paris, intending to use the 4th arrondissement's facilities and unique terrain to make a final stand against the Germans. Fortunately, none of this came to pass. Laurent drove along Boulevard Saint-Antoine, finally stopping in front of the headquarters. The 2 guards standing at the door immediately sprang to attention, but Charles could sense their slacking off. Although they remained motionless at attention, their eyes were darting around, trying to size him up. They must have heard that Charles was coming to headquarters as a staff officer, and were filled with curiosity, wanting to see what this legendary Charles was like. Perhaps it was pride, but Charles was even a little worried that they would be disappointed. The first floor was the communications department, with a constant ringing of telephones and many uniformed communications soldiers moving about. When Charles entered, their voices visibly paused, the communications soldiers' steps slowed, and all eyes were fixed on him. There was admiration, envy, and of course, jealousy. One of the communications soldiers mustered his courage and stepped forward to Charles, extending his hand. "You must be young Master Charles?" "Welcome, thank you," Charles replied, appearing somewhat reserved, a little intimidated by the room full of soldiers. Laurent led Charles up the stairs with practiced ease, checking his pocket watch along the way, then turning back to instruct, "General Guerrieri always gets up at 8 o'clock. We have 20 minutes left, we can wait." Before he could finish, Laurent noticed General Guerrieri standing at the top of the stairs. He wore a faded uniform, his once bright red trousers now tinged with pink, and a pistol hung from his belt, giving him a rather imposing appearance. A smile unconsciously appeared on his lips when he saw Charles. "General, you?" Laurent paused, then understood. The general had broken his decades-long habit to come and greet Charles. Guerrieri longed to step forward and affectionately put his arm around Charles's shoulder, cheerfully saying, "Welcome, little guy, we've been waiting for you." However, there were no secrets from the capitalists at headquarters, and many even took leaking intelligence for granted as making extra money. Guerrieri could only keep a straight face and say with no small amount of sarcasm, "Look who's here, the great savior of France. We've been waiting for you to teach us how to fight." Several people nearby laughed in agreement. They understood Guerrieri's tone. They just didn't see the wink Guerrieri gave Charles, as if to say, "I'm telling the truth, Charles, you truly are the savior of France." Chapter 65 The Cunning Little Guy. Charles was assigned a private dormitory room. Although it was small, only 7 square meters, and simply furnished with a bed, a table and chair, and a small bookshelf, this was a privilege reserved for colonels. Lieutenant colonels and below shared rooms with 2 or even 4 people, small rooms with 4 bunk beds. Charles became a second lieutenant, the rank of officers after graduating from military academy, even though Charles hadn't attended one. Guerrieri said, "This guy invented the tank and the sidecar motorcycle. They really played a significant role on the battlefield. Giving him a colonel wouldn't be unreasonable. He then added, "If anyone can give us some useful inventions like him, I'll give them the same rank." No one objected, so Charles received a full set of equipment befitting a second lieutenant, 2 sets of uniforms for changing, with a gold stripe on the cuffs, a pair of binoculars with a case, which could be easily carried on the shoulder, and a whistle, used for giving orders to soldiers and sometimes for communication or warning between officers. A revolver, M1892, for command and self-defense. An M1845 infantry officer's sidearm, which Charles loved dearly, captivated by its beauty from the moment he received it. Exquisitely crafted, it featured a brass handguard, a single-piece steel blade, 2 flutes of varying widths, and the manufacturer's stamp on the handguard. However, at 87 centimeters long, it nearly touched the ground when draped at his waist. Charles understood that carrying it into battle would be suicidal. It would serve no purpose and only hinder his movements. Ultimately, Charles could only regretfully place it on his bedside table as decoration. Changing into his uniform, Charles couldn't resist admiring himself in the mirror. He had to admit, the French uniforms of this period were quite stylish, but aesthetics and the battlefield often clashed. The more beautiful and vibrant something was, the more attention it attracted, which also meant a quicker death. Opening the door to his quarters, he found his orderly, Adrian, waiting at the entrance. Adrian had been assigned to Charles by Gallieri and was responsible for all of Charles's needs. Adrian looked him up and down, then suddenly panicked. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant. My mistake, I didn't bring you spurs." "I'll get you spurs right away." "Spurs?" Charles stopped Adrian. "No, they're not necessary. I can't ride a horse, but," Adrian explained, "every officer can ride a horse. Even if they can't now, they will in the future." Charles was taken aback, then understood. Horses were very important to officers at this time. They sometimes needed to ride and brandish their swords to command troops in battle, or to gallop around the ranks and shout orders so everyone could hear them. While Charles and his staff officers didn't need to go to the battlefield, they often had tasks like delivering documents, intelligence, or providing temporary command, which frequently required them to ride. However, to ride a warhorse and command infantry on the battlefield? The thought sent a shiver down Charles's spine. He would never do such a thing, not now, and certainly not in the future. "No need, Adrian." Charles glanced at his boots and persisted in his opinion. "This is fine, Adrian." Someone called out, "Have you forgotten that the lieutenant owns a motorcycle factory? He's producing motorcycles for our army. And you're making him ride a horse and boots with spurs." Hearing this, Adrian understood, a motorcycle might be a better choice. However, Charles also couldn't ride a motorcycle. At this moment, Gallieri walked over, looking Charles up and down with a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. But he said sarcastically, "No wonder you're from a capitalist family, Lieutenant. You're well maintained. I wonder if this little flower grown in a greenhouse could withstand the ravages of the army." "Yes, General," Charles could only reply. Gallieri turned and called out to someone not far away, "Fernand." "Yes, General." A lieutenant colonel jogged over and stood at attention in front of Gallieri. "He's yours." Gallieri waved his white gloves at Charles. "Tell him what to do, and before that, teach him how to salute." "Yes, General." Fernand stepped forward and replied, turning to Charles. "Come with me, Lieutenant, let's go downstairs." The training ground was in the backyard of headquarters, where flowers and dwarf trees grew, and in the center stood a statue of Gilbert Dumotor. Gilbert was the man who drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen and designed the French tricolor flag. He also participated in both the American Revolutionary War and the French Revolution, and was known as a hero of two worlds. Fernand chose to train Charles in the open space in front of the statue, and Charles suspected that Fernand wanted to use the statue to educate him, a capitalist. As a teacher, Fernand was quite competent. He trained Charles seriously, just like with a recruit, teaching him saluting, marching, and the proper posture for holding a gun. Charles wasn't a good student. He found it somewhat boring, but he deceptively acted very serious and enthusiastic. If this were proper training, it would take at least several months. Fernand frowned at Charles's poor posture. "But the general only gave me 1 day." "God, what can you learn in 1 day?" Charles wanted to tell him. "Lieutenant Colonel, is it possible that General Gerlini only gave you 1 day not because he wanted you to train me well in 1 day, but because he didn't want to waste too much time?" But Charles said nothing. He believed Gerlini was waiting to find fault with him. This might be his real reason for having Charles train his posture. Charles was right. At that moment, Gallieni was watching Charles from the operations department on the second floor, hoping to see Charles disobey orders or argue with Fernand. Only then could Gallieni walk up to Charles with his head held high and reprimand him righteously. What do you think the army is? Do you think that just because you invented the tank and the sidecar, you can disregard military discipline and become an exception? That you can be above others and even disobey orders? This is the army. A place where discipline and obedience are paramount, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done before, or how many merits you've accumulated. Now, you're just a second lieutenant. However, Gallieni never managed to seize this opportunity, leaving him feeling like he'd punched a soft pillow. He had rehearsed his lines, even imagining the actions and Charles's aggrieved expression, but nothing came of it. Gallieni was frustrated and frantic. He paced back and forth in the operations room, peeking through the window every now and then, while Charles was diligently studying the entire time. Even if he wasn't learning very well. Suddenly, Gallieni stopped in his tracks, paused for a moment, and then chuckled self-deprecatingly. The cunning little fellow, he guessed it all. It was all part of his plan. Chapter 66. Charles's work. Charles's job was to report directly to General Gallieni, essentially delivering the latest intelligence to him. It sounded like a simple task, just relaying intelligence, but it was actually quite complex. You must have a considerable understanding of the battlefield. Fernand placed a thick stack of maps and a pile of documents nearly half a person's height in front of Charles. You're a staff officer, not a communications soldier. A communications soldier only needs to be literate, speak, and walk. But you must be ready to answer the general's questions at any time, such as where a certain unit is, what the battlefield situation is, and so on. How can I memorize all of that? Charles looked at the pile of documents in surprise. You don't need to memorize it, Lieutenant. Fernand raised an eyebrow. Let me tell you a little secret. Wherever there's recent fighting, you should learn as much as possible about that area and follow up as needed. That's how you'll be able to answer the general's questions. Charles thought it made perfect sense. After all, the situation was constantly evolving, and the general was unlikely to ask about past battles or unrelated circumstances. Thinking it over, Charles spread his hands over the documents in front of him. So, Lieutenant Colonel, what do I need these for? Fernand's smug expression slowly faded. He realized he'd given away his little secret a bit too soon. What Charles didn't know was that his mission was actually meticulously planned by Gallieni. Before this, Gallieni rarely went to the lounge. If he did, it was because he was exhausted. But since Charles arrived, he went to the lounge more often and for longer periods, sometimes even having someone bring him a cup of coffee and some fruit. The staff in the operations room didn't find this strange. They explained Gallieni's change as a shift in the war situation. Before, when the Germans were at the gates of Paris, of course, they had to fight with all their might. Now that the Germans had retreated, the front lines were gradually moving away from Paris and a counterattack was hopeless. Relaxing was perfectly normal, especially since Gallieni was already 65 years old, and his health didn't allow for overexertion. But the reason wasn't what they thought. Charles had made many preparations before sending the intelligence. As Fernand had said, he had noted down some place names and the general situation of the current battle, including the location and status of relevant troops, so that he wouldn't have to consult them on the spot when problems arose. Consulting on the spot at this time was no easy task. It might require sifting through a mountain of intelligence and documents to find the answer. However, Charles found that his preparations were meaningless. Charles, holding a telegram, gently knocked on the wooden door of the lounge. After receiving permission, he pushed open the door and reported, "General, the 5th Army has advanced another 3 kilometers north and has now reached the Unnar region. The 5th Army's harassment tactics were the most successful, making its offensive unstoppable. They had left other units more than 10 kilometers behind, thus forming a salient on the offensive line. Major General Monnery, commander of the 6th Army, believed that the 5th Army should halt its advance and wait for other units, otherwise it risked being encircled by the Germans." Gallieni, who was looking down at the map, grunted, took the telegram, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it on the ground. "What do you think?" he asked. "What?" Charles didn't understand. "Do you think Major General Monnery is right?" Gallieni asked calmly, his gaze fixed on the map. "Should we halt the 5th Army?" Charles gasped, staring blankly at Gallieni. Shouldn't this old man be asking which armies are on the left and right flanks of the 5th Army, whether their logistics are keeping up, and where the reinforcements are? The thought had barely formed when Gallieni pointed to the map and began to explain. The Fifth Army's left flank is the Third Army, and its right flank is the Eighth Army. While these two armies aren't progressing as quickly as the Fifth Army, they are advancing steadily. The Fifth Army just received a batch of reinforcements last night, so their troop strength shouldn't be a problem. Also, they captured a warehouse abandoned by the Germans a few days ago, which has given them a significant food supply. Charles was confused by this. "Old man, did you steal my lines?" Seeing that Charles didn't answer, Gallieni looked up at him and asked, "What's wrong? Is your position as a staff officer limiting your talents, or is your rank as a second lieutenant restricting your imagination?" "This isn't like you, General," Charles replied. "The question you asked seems to be one you need to consider." "That's right, Charles." Gallieni looked at Charles meaningfully, "but a staff officer is my assistant, and also part of my brain. So, I'm thinking." Charles didn't understand at first, but after a while, he finally understood. If Charles, as a staff officer, was part of Gallieni's brain, then Charles's thinking was equivalent to Gallieni's thinking, and Charles solving a problem was equivalent to Gallieni solving a problem. Could it be interpreted like that? Seeing Charles still hesitating, Gallieni raised his head slightly. "It seems you're not very suited to thinking, Charles. In that case, I can only have you practice military posture. It might suit you better, and you seem to like it." He then looked up as if to call for Fernand. "No, General." Charles quickly stopped him. He was long tired of responding to commands like a robot, repeating them over and over again. It was torture for Charles. His feigned enjoyment was to avoid giving the old man a weakness, but it seemed to have no effect whatsoever. Noticing the difficulty on Charles's face, Gallieni's lips curled into a smug smile. He gestured with his chin towards the map on the table and said, "Then let me see if you're suited for thinking." Charles reluctantly leaned closer, looked at the map for a moment, and said, "I think we shouldn't stop the Fifth Army. Instead, we should speed it up." "Why?" Gallieni asked, puzzled. He had considered keeping the Fifth Army at a certain speed, but he hadn't thought of speeding it up. This kid had surprised him again. "Remember what I said before about special operations?" Charles countered. Gallieni's eyes lit up instantly. This new term had been tormenting him for days. Seeing Gallieni's excited expression, Charles suddenly wondered if all of this was part of Gallieni's plan. Standing at attention, this special job, and the rest room, was it all just a coincidence? Chapter 67 Special Operations. Charles straightened his military cap. It was as stiff as dry bread, definitely uncomfortable to wear in battle, and more importantly, offered no protection whatsoever. However, this was a good thing for Charles. He immediately thought of providing the French army with helmets. Helmets may be small, but approximately 8.5 million French soldiers were drafted for World War I. If everyone needed one, the profits could rival those of motorcycles. Charles's daydream was interrupted by Gallieni. "Are you thinking or just spacing out, Lieutenant?" Charles grunted, refocusing his attention on the map. "First, there's the safety of the Fifth Army." He pointed to the map, saying, "The Third and Eighth Armies on the flanks are advancing steadily, and their logistical support is not a major problem. Their manpower is relatively stable, so there's no need to worry too much about them being encircled by the Germans." Gallieni nodded slightly in agreement. This was the same thought he had. While the salient on the offensive line was dangerous, and the Fifth Army could indeed be encircled, how could the Germans encircle them? Cut off the Fifth Army's communication with other units? Once the Fifth Army slows down, the Third and Eighth Armies can continue their advance, immediately encircling the German forces that have infiltrated and surrounded the Fifth Army. Danger is relative. With the added element of harassment warfare, this German maneuver is even more dangerous. Gallieni knows that on the battlefield, no plan is safe, only dangerous and ever more dangerous. If the enemy is more dangerous than oneself, the plan is feasible. Other generals, including Joffre, intended to halt the Fifth Army because they were terrified of the Germans. They still feared the enemy and lacked confidence in the French army. However, why should we speed things up? Gallieni asked curiously. Do you want to lure the Germans into encircling them? Referring to the Fifth Army, Gallieni didn't think it was a good idea. The Germans weren't stupid. Obvious traps on the battlefield wouldn't lure the enemy in. Charles smiled slightly. The Germans would think the same thing. Gallieni immediately realized he had been tricked. He had been outmaneuvered by Charles in this game, and Charles had anticipated his prediction. Interesting. Gallieni casually picked up his pince-nez and put it on his nose, which allowed him to see more clearly. So, Your goal is precisely to prevent the Germans from encircling the Fifth Army. You could say that, Charles replied. If the Germans do that, we'll have no choice but to fight them in a conventional war. The Germans might suffer losses, but our losses won't be any less, Gallery agreed. The quality of the German army was undeniable. Even though they were exhausted from harassment warfare, their fighting capacity was still comparable to the French army. If the two armies were to encircle and annihilate each other, it would inevitably be a brutal war of attrition. Then, Gallieni put himself in the shoes of the German commander, slowly moving back with the flag of the German Second Army, and said, "What if I don't encircle them, but continue to retreat? Checkmate." Charles slammed his pencil down on the German rear of the lines. "I will checkmate you." Note, checkmate is French for checkmating the opponent's king in chess. What? Gallieni looked up at Charles in shock. "You can't do it, Charles. How can you break through my lines 20 kilometers behind?" Before he could finish, Gallieni suddenly realized something. This breach was one he had created himself. With the Second Army retreating, the Fifth Army had already broken through the lines 20 kilometers. Sending out detachments along mountain roads from the flanks to penetrate the enemy lines would directly threaten the rear of the German forces on both flanks. "My God," Gallieni exclaimed, his face paling. "Then, the frigate troops won't be facing regular German troops, but rather German supply convoys, field hospitals, and vulnerable artillery." Charles neither confirmed nor denied this. Gallieni was right about one thing: Charles's targets were never the German forces directly in front. Then Gallieni asked, puzzled, "Why is this tactic called special operations?" Charles said softly, "If, as you say, the frigate troops are only attacking supply convoys, field hospitals, or vulnerable artillery, then it's not special operations. But if we have a planned and targeted attack on enemy warehouses, ammunition depots, command posts, railway stations, and bridges, then that's special operations." Gallieni was speechless. Warehouses and ammunition depots were obviously more important. They could often be burned down with just a single fire, reducing an entire army group's supplies to ashes. Attacking enemy command posts could create chaos and disarray among the enemy. If the train station and bridges were destroyed, the German army's supplies would be cut off, leaving them with no choice but to retreat completely. After a moment's thought, Gallieni asked again, "So, are they just different targets?" Charles inwardly praised him. Gallieni was Gallieni after all. He saw things from a different perspective. An ordinary commander, upon hearing Charles's idea, might first react with, "Great! Let's fight like this, we'll win an unprecedented victory," and then begin deploying troops and preparing for battle. These lower and mid-level commanders only thought about immediate victory. Gallieni, however, focused more on military theory. Once he mastered the theory and understood its key points, Gallieni could not only win this battle, but also apply the theory to other campaigns and even integrate it with French tactics. "It's not just a different target, General," Charles replied. "It's much more difficult than attacking supply convoys or artillery, but the casualties might be less and the results greater." Charles's words seemed contradictory. Greater difficulty, didn't that mean greater casualties and less results? Gallery understood, nodding thoughtfully. "If the target is an enemy warehouse, ammunition depot, command post, bridge, our first priority is to know their location, the number of troops stationed there, and any defensive weaknesses." "So," Gallery abruptly looked up at Charles, his voice trembling with excitement. "I understand. It's intelligence, Charles. We must have accurate intelligence, then, based on that intelligence, we must complete the mission as quickly as possible and withdraw, leaving the Germans with an unmanageable mess." Charles calmly nodded. Gallery had grasped the essence of special operations. Gallery stared blankly at Charles, his face filled with disbelief. "This can't be described as genius, Charles. You are 100 times better than all of us combined. You simply don't belong to this world." Charles couldn't answer that question, because Gallery had given the answer. Chapter 68 Charlemagne is more useful. As dusk approached, Brownie and his men returned to their camp amidst the cheers of the Fifth Army's officers and soldiers. This was his fifth harassment tactic, and although it had yielded little result, safety was the priority. Brownie liked this tactic, not only because it was Charles's idea, but also because it was safe. Nobody dislikes safety, Brownie joked with his men during a mission. "If there is, let him sign up with me, and I'll make sure he gets his wish." His men laughed, believing Brownie's words to be true. Nevertheless, by this point in the battle, Brownie's sidecar motorcycles had been lost by then over 30 times. Some were due to malfunctions, others to accidents on mountain roads. Sidecar motorcycles were difficult to control, especially on mountain roads. But many more were tragically killed by German riflemen. Before each mission, Brownie would emphasize again and again, "Our goal is to harass the enemy and make them uneasy, so we don't need to get too close. Just enough for the bullets to barely hit us is sufficient. Remember, when you can see the enemy and aim, they can also aim at you, and probably see you even better. So, getting close to the enemy is not a wise move, it will send you to your deathbed." This should have been easy to execute. The Maxim machine gun's firepower covered an area, posing a threat to the enemy from a kilometer away, while at that time, the enemy could barely see them through binoculars. However, there were always those who wanted to see the enemy clearly and kill them, whether they wanted to become heroes, were out of habit, or simply wanted to try out the Germans' marksmanship. The result was that nearly 20 sidecars remained on the battlefield forever. Brownie rode a sidecar to his tent and wearily stepped off the driver's seat, his legs stiff and numb. Harassment warfare, while safer, required constant movement, forcing even Brownie, the commander, to learn to drive and ride in rotation. After several days, some even said they'd rather lie on the bed like a prostitute than ride on this thing again. Brownie's only thought right now was to take a shower and get a good night's sleep, everything else could wait. However, General Guard called him back. "Is everything going well, Colonel?" "Everything's going well, General," Brownie replied. Brownie had been promoted to colonel, but to him, the only difference was the 2 gold stripes on his cuffs. He still rode his sidecar and commanded the same men. Oh yes, the sidecar fleet had grown considerably, from 100 to 350, plus 2-wheeled motorcycles. Brownie's men probably numbered 2,000. However, most of these men were scattered across various locations conducting harassment warfare, some even disappearing without a chance to meet. "Come to my headquarters," Major General Guard said. "Yes, General," Brownie responded, his legs numb and throbbing with pain as he walked towards the command post, the legs feeling like countless ants gnawing at him. Finally reaching the tent and standing before Major General Guard, Brownie stood at attention and gave a crisp salute. Major General Guard rummaged through a pile of documents for a moment, then pulled one out and handed it to Brownie, saying, "This is your new assignment, Colonel." Colonel Brownie opened the document, glanced at it, and immediately frowned, complaining, "Reconnaissance? And you want to find the enemy's ammunition depot and command post? We are soldiers, not spies, General." "I don't think this is appropriate." Brownie's words weren't insubordination. Ever since he led 200 men in a charge against 20,000 German troops, killing and wounding thousands and destroying dozens of artillery pieces while suffering only 23 casualties himself, he had been appointed staff officer of the 5th Army. One of his duties was to provide advice to Major General Guard, including tactical suggestions. "Really?" Major General Guard looked doubtful. "But this is General Gallieni's order." "No one's order matters, General." Brownie shook his head. "This is too dangerous. We've never received this kind of training, but this is also a tactic proposed by Charles," Major General Guard said. "Charles? Charles's tactic?" Colonel Brownie looked at Major General Guard in surprise. "Yes," Major General Guard nodded. "Charles is now a staff officer under General Gallieni. I heard he's a second lieutenant." Although Gallieni didn't write it down in documents, he verbally informed people of the tactic over the phone so that they would have confidence in it. This was Gallieni's brilliance. Verbal communication over the phone leaves no evidence, and it's not impossible for him to deny it later. However, there seemed to be little need to hide it. Charles's military talent couldn't be hidden no matter how hard he tried, especially since he was already in the army. "Let me take another look, General." Brownie turned his gaze back to the document, pondered for a moment, and then his tone changed, becoming smooth and natural without the slightest awkwardness. "A very interesting plan, though unexpected. It's a bold innovation." Major General Guard raised an eyebrow, a hint of humor on his face. "Do you think the plan is feasible?" "Of course." Colonel Brownie nodded emphatically. "Of course it's feasible, General. It's very well thought out. It tells us to go through the enemy lines, park our motorcycles in the mountains and hide them, then dress as civilians and blend into the crowd. No one will recognize us. You see, the Germans are on French soil, and the occupied areas are full of French people. We can easily get their help." "Then, what about the offensive phase?" Major General Guard asked again. The offensive phase was even more spectacular. Colonel Brownie's eyes were filled with admiration, his tone even bordering on worship. He even considered that the Germans also produced sidecar motorcycles, and indeed they did. The Germans tried to use sidecar motorcycles to counter our harassment tactics, though not many, but we noticed. Charles immediately exploited this. He had us disguise ourselves as Germans and drive the sidecar motorcycles towards the enemy command post and ammunition depot. We happened to be using German Maxim rifles. Are these all just coincidences? Or did Charles anticipate this? Incredible, Major General Guard finally asked. So, do you accept this plan? Of course, General, Colonel Brownie answered firmly. Why not? It will create another miracle, and this could be an opportunity for us. Major General Guard laughed. It seemed Charles was far more useful than General Galini. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 69: The Military Uniform Effect. Charles returned to the town on the morning of the third day. This was Gallieri implementing the House of Representatives' decision to give Charles a relatively relaxed environment so that he has the time and conditions to continue inventing new equipment. Charles had a 2-day leave followed by a day off, meaning he served 2 days in the army and went home on the third. Charles was probably the only soldier in the entire army with such leave. During wartime, soldiers needed to either perform great service, bribe officers, or even sacrifice their own hands and feet to get leave. Laurent dropped Charles off at his doorstep and left. His job was complementary to Charles's. When Charles was in Paris, he was Charles's driver and bodyguard. When Charles was in Lavas, he was responsible for the factory's security and secrecy. So, after dropping Charles off, he immediately drove to the factory. It was about 9 in the morning, and the sunlight was lazily shining on the town's ground, like a thin layer of sand. Charles opened the door and found no one there. It was normal that Djoko wasn't there. He should be at the factory at this time. Camille. Charles suddenly realized he didn't know what Camille was supposed to be doing during this time. Recalling the day he was locked up at home, Camille would go to the nearby market to buy groceries after breakfast, and Charles guessed she would be there. He felt he should at least tell Camille before going to the factory, otherwise she wouldn't even know he was back. Walking alone on the streets of the small town, Charles felt something was off. Usually, the neighbors would greet him warmly, and Charles couldn't keep up with them. Now, however, they were all busy with their own things, not even glancing at him, as if they didn't see him at all. Charles didn't understand what was going on until Teddy walked past him while eating pizza. "Teddy," Charles called out. Teddy turned around at the sound of his voice, glanced at Charles, and suddenly his eyes widened. The pizza in his hand fell to the ground, and his face and mouth were smeared with bits of onion. Charles, it's you, Charles." Teddy swallowed hard. "Am I that hard to recognize?" Charles asked doubtfully. He had only been gone for 2 days. No, Teddy's tongue stammered with nervousness. You're a soldier." "No, an officer." Charles seemed to understand. This was why he was symbolically labeled a soldier in uniform. Soldiers had been constantly coming and going in the town lately, even on patrols. The people had become accustomed to it and automatically ignored all the soldiers. It was none of their business. The neighbors probably ignored Charles for the same reason as Teddy. They didn't recognize him. Teddy looked at Charles's uniform with immense envy, his gaze shifting to the revolver at Charles's waist. He couldn't help but exclaim "Wow," his eyes gleaming with amazement. Is it real?" "Of course." Charles drew the revolver and shook it in his hand. It wasn't loaded. Charles hadn't even tried. I can try." "No, Teddy." Charles shook his head. "We have orders. We must protect our weapons." Of course, Teddy's eyes held regret, but his envy of Charles deepened. While his classmates were idle due to the school closure, Charles had become an officer, carrying a brand new revolver. Charles shook his head with a wry smile. They would regret it once they got a weapon and donned their uniforms. Just then, Charles saw a familiar figure, Camille, returning from grocery shopping. She carried a basket filled with potatoes, onions, and what appeared to be some beef. Charles quickly put away his gun, dropped Teddy, and rushed to meet her, instinctively reaching out to take the basket from Camille. Camille was startled by Charles's action. Lost in thought, she wondered how Charles was doing in Paris, whether he was adjusting to military life, and most of all, whether he would be sent to the front lines. Suddenly, An officer reached out to snatch her things. She screamed and stumbled back, dropping several potatoes. The surrounding neighbors cast wary glances, thinking someone intended to harm Camille. "It's me, Mama." Charles regretted his rashness. He should have realized the uniform effect would also apply to Camille. Camille froze, unable to believe that the person standing before her was Charles, dressed in a military uniform, and seemingly with rank. Then it dawned on her, Charles had joined the army, so of course he was wearing a uniform. "Charles," Camille gasped for breath, as if her mouth had just been gagged. All her fear instantly transformed into joy. She looked Charles up and down with pride, occasionally touching his cap and collar, murmuring, "It really is you, Charles. Look at you, you're a second lieutenant now." The neighbors recognized Charles too, exclaiming, "My God, it's Master Charles. I almost didn't recognize him. Look at him, he's grown up." Then someone called out to the couple, "The uniform suits you well, Master Charles. You have a wonderful child, Mrs. Bernard." Camille proudly took Charles's hand, thanking each neighbor, a radiant smile on her face. Nothing brings a mother more satisfaction than praising her child. Charles seemed a little uncomfortable being treated like a child, using the excuse of carrying Camille's shopping basket to break free from Camille's affectionate gesture. Just then, a patrol passed by, and the soldiers, seeing a lieutenant in the distance, saluted. As he drew closer, they exclaimed in surprise, "My God, that's Master Charles. He's become a lieutenant. What a capitalist. He's only been in the army for a few days and he's already a lieutenant. Damn it, shouldn't he? Have you forgotten how many merits he's made?" The Guard Company had its share of Charles supporters, but also staunch opponents of capitalism, and their conflict remained unresolved. If an officer hadn't intervened, they might have started fighting in the street again. Charles guessed that this was probably a status quo Laurent was intentionally maintaining. When reporters came to visit, Laurent would pull aside those who opposed the capitalists for interviews. They would complain to the reporters, "Protect the capitalists? We don't have that kind of free time. Our job is to make sure they don't make mistakes. Yes, who knows if the capitalists will sell technology to the enemy for money. They're capable of anything. We should be prepared." In important core areas, such as near Charles's house, the factory, and the roads, Laurent arranged for Charles's supporters to guard them, and they would do their utmost to ensure Charles's safety. This is called adapting to local conditions and making the best use of resources. Laurent wasn't as stupid as he seemed, he was just a bit unlucky. Chapter 70 Uncle's Conspiracy. Back home, Camille grabbed Charles and bombarded him with questions. How was the army? How was the food? What were the lodgings like? It seemed Charles had been gone for 2 years, not just 2, and she, who had never cared about the army before, was now asking about their daily routines. Even worse, she still wouldn't let Charles go out alone. "Wait for your father to come back and take you," Camille said earnestly. "It won't take long, I'll call him." "Mom," Charles protested. "There are soldiers everywhere along the way, and I'm a soldier too." He patted the revolver at his waist, even though he hadn't learned how to use it. But that didn't matter, Camille didn't know that. She simply thought a revolver would fire as soon as you pulled the trigger and kill bad guys. This made her think calling Joka back was unnecessary. "All right, Charles," Camille agreed. Her eyes were full of reluctance. If she weren't so helpless at the factory, she might have stayed by Charles's side. "Go and come back quickly," Camille instructed. "You need to rest." "I will." Charles said goodbye to Camille and left the house. This time, the neighbors regained their usual enthusiasm, and Charles received their greetings and praises along the way. Some women even blew him kisses, which made Charles stand up straight to make himself look more like an adult. The soldiers he encountered along the way also saluted Charles one by one, their eyes showing a strange look, as if they could not associate Charles, a 17-year-old boy, with commanders. Charles walked along the road towards the factory. When he turned a corner, there was a short blind spot. Suddenly, a car swerved out from the other end and almost hit Charles, but fortunately, the driver braked in time. "Are you crazy?" the driver cursed first. "Watch where you're going, you bastard." The driver was being unreasonable. Charles was walking on the right side of the road without any problem. The car was clearly driving against a flow of traffic and was drunk. Charles could smell alcohol in the dust. Then Charles recognized the driver as Pierre, the man he should call uncle. Pierre recognized Charles, seemingly intrigued by his military uniform. After scrutinizing Charles from head to toe, he chuckled incoherently, a laugh and demeanor that made him appear mentally unstable. "It's Charles. Sorry, I didn't recognize you earlier. Look at you, a soldier now." Pierre staggered out of the car, burped after standing up, and seemed to want to vomit but couldn't. Charles quickly stepped back to avoid him. "Speaking of which, you should thank me." Pierre braced himself against the car to keep from falling. "Why?" Charles asked sarcastically. "Is it because you sent me to the army?" No. Pierre shook his head with a smile. "You think it's just the army?" Charles looked at Pierre with suspicion. He wondered what else he didn't know, or was this just Pierre's drunken ramblings? Pierre chuckled like a fool again. "Look at you, you know nothing. I know your father, Charles. I know what kind of man he is, and of course I know what kind of woman he likes. So, I found your mother in town and hired her to be our maid. If I hadn't done that, you might not exist, right? Shouldn't you thank me for that?" Charles was stunned. Pierre was an expert at flirting with women, and he could easily make Joka fall head over heels for a maid. Francis, on the other hand, was a man who valued social standing and family background, and he would never allow his youngest son to marry a maid. This is where the conflict arose. As everyone knows, Joka was kicked out early and lived a life of discrimination and poverty, while Pierre inherited Francis's fortune. But Charles wasn't angry. He nodded. "I should thank you, Pierre." Pierre was about to say something when several soldiers called out from a distance, "Sir, is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," Charles replied loudly. Perhaps Pierre realized Charles was not someone to mess with, muttered a few words, climbed into the car, waved defiantly at Charles, and drove off. Laurent rushed over, anxiously asking, "That drunkard, he didn't hit you, did he?" No. Charles shook his head. "I'm fine." He turned and walked towards the factory without looking back. Laurent glanced in the direction the car had gone, seemingly recognizing the Francis family, who were related to Charles. He couldn't say anything about it, so he just snorted and turned to follow Charles. Charles slowed his pace, turned his head, and asked innocently, "Major, I want to know what the upper and lower age limits are for military service." 18 to 46, Laurent replied, his tone gradually hardening. "As a second lieutenant, you should know this very well." Then he added, "You're an exception, although there's no real reason for it." Laurent thought Charles was asking why he had to serve at 17. Charles didn't speak, then paused and asked, "Can I recommend someone for military service?" Laurent was taken aback. Recommend someone for military service? That was a novelty, but I think so. Laurent nodded, as long as he meets the requirements, of course, Charles said confidently. An adult, male, 43 years old, unemployed, shouldn't he join the army? Indeed, Laurent replied, unless there are special circumstances. Then Laurent asked again, "What's his name?" "Pierre," Charles answered calmly. "Pierre Bernard." Laurent was stunned. That was Charles's uncle, the drunk driver from earlier. But Laurent laughed, confidently saying, "Good idea, Charles. I can also instruct the troops to give him special treatment." Charles gave a satisfied hum. Pierre had messed with the wrong person. He should know that among everyone, he was the least powerful and the least capable. He was nothing but a spoiled brat, a parasite who only knew how to indulge in debauchery and wait to inherit the family fortune. The only reason he hadn't received the conscription order was because Francis had manipulated it. But this manipulation was easy to uncover, especially since Laurent was the one investigating. Francis didn't even know about it, and by the time the conscription order reached Pierre, it was too late. Manipulating the conscription order before it was issued was relatively easy. Once issued, forcibly withdrawing it could cause public outrage, because it meant that ordinary people could also avoid military service, and then no one would go to the battlefield, a price no one could afford. Would traditional nobles like Grevy and Armand step in to help Pierre? A party leader and member of parliament helping a capitalist son evade military service? Once it was reported in the newspapers, Grevy and Armand's political careers would be over. Therefore, no one could save Pierre. Charles couldn't wait to see Pierre's expression when he received the conscription order. Chapter 71 The Development of Motorcycle Factories. Charles first visited the motorcycle factory, even though he knew Joka wasn't there. At this time, the motorcycle factory was a major source of income for Charles, generating approximately 20,000 francs in profit each month. This was a considerable sum, considering the worker's monthly wage was only 28 francs. The motorcycle factory had been stable, But that didn't mean Charles could simply ignore it and let it fend for itself. That would affect employee morale and enthusiasm. Therefore, no matter how busy Charles was, no matter how unnecessary it was, and even though he knew the motorcycle's potential was limited, Charles would still make time to visit the factory to avoid giving the employees the impression of favoritism. When Charles appeared at the motorcycle factory, the employees were first surprised by his military uniform, then whispered among themselves, "Look, young Master Charles just got back and came here to inspect." This shows how much he values the motorcycle factory. Of course, think about those orders from the military. They can keep us working with peace of mind for years to come. Work hard, this is where the most hope lies. Guillaume hurriedly came forward, hesitating for a moment as he looked at Charles's uniform. "Should I call you Lieutenant, young Master Charles?" "Whatever you wish, Uncle Guillaume," Charles replied. "No matter how you address me, my address to you will never change." Guillaume's eyes instantly filled with emotion and a touch of relief. For a moment, he suddenly had the illusion that Charles was truly his nephew. "Is everything all right?" Charles asked casually. "Everything is fine, Master Charles," Guillaume nodded, leading Charles deeper into the factory as he walked, saying, "These past few days I've been planning to reorganize the factory's production line. The previous plan wasn't very efficient, causing some parts to be produced too quickly and others too slowly. This left some workers idle while others worked overtime but still couldn't keep up. The reorganization will largely solve this problem. With the same machines and the same number of workers, we could potentially increase production by about 5%. Charles praised him highly. "You always surprise me, Uncle Guillaume. I feel very reassured with you around." He knew he shouldn't use phrases like "very good" or "you did a great job," as those were too formal, too mechanical, and lacked creativity. Sometimes, a slight change in wording can make the other person feel much better and get them to give 120% of their effort. Why not? Before leaving, Charles offered another suggestion. "Besides increasing production, I think we should also innovate a bit, Uncle Guillaume." "You're right," Guillaume nodded repeatedly. "I've thought of that too. We can't just stand still, or we'll be overtaken sooner or later." But after a moment's hesitation, Guillaume replied somewhat awkwardly, "But I don't know which direction to develop in." Guillaume was an honest man. He didn't shy away from his weaknesses. He excelled at reforming and innovating parts, but developing broader strategic directions wasn't his forte. Charles casually offered an answer. "We can consider the needs of the battlefield. For example, could we convert sidecar motorcycles into transport vehicles? They could transport ammunition and food to the battlefield and then bring the wounded back." It was necessary to occasionally demonstrate some talent, so as not to be seen by the employees as a useless person who knew nothing but money, which would earn them their contempt. Guillaume's eyes widened. "A brilliant idea, Master Charles. I know what to do." "Good heavens, we're about to get another huge order. Pay attention to the injured's experience," Charles cautioned. "This means improving the suspension, otherwise the injured might die on the road." "Of course, Master Charles," Guillaume replied. "I'll get to the design right away." Before leaving, he turned back and added, "It's an honor to work for you, Master Charles." I'm very lucky. In Guillaume's view, as a worker, nothing was better than dignity, honor, and generous compensation. He felt very satisfied, believing this was a factory worth dedicating his life to. After leaving the motorcycle factory, Charles went to the tractor factory next door. The tractor factory actually took a piece of land from the motorcycle factory, and even borrowed some of the factory buildings and warehouses. The reason was that motorcycles required a large area, which was no longer necessary. Previously, when it was for civilian use, it was necessary to train each customer by providing a training area. At that time, a large area was essential. If two customers were learning to drive on the same area, they might collide while riding their motorcycles. But providing motorcycles to the military was a different story. They required everyone to practice together. When Guillaume asked the soldiers to practice separately and then regroup once they were proficient, the officers glared and roared, "We don't have time, old man. Besides, we're going to the battlefield to face enemy bullets and shells. What's a little danger compared to that?" In fact, the military didn't really need a training ground. Once they knew how to start a motorcycle, how to shift gears, and where the accelerator and brake were, they were off on the road and even heading to the battlefield. Thus, a large area of the motorcycle factory became useless. Charles had a low wall built between the areas, enclosing the space and a few buildings, and the tractor factory was formed. Charles went straight to the research and development department, the heart of the factory, where he was building the prototype of the Mark I tank. Djoka and Joseph were there. When Charles entered, they were busy working on the enormous, rhomboid steel behemoth. "Hey, Charles," Djoka wasn't surprised to see Charles. "I heard it from Camille on the phone." Djoka stepped forward, sized up Charles, and explained, "Although we're all reluctant to let you join the army, this uniform really suits you." Joseph put down his tools and walked up to Charles, greeting him. "It's a pleasure to meet you, young Master Charles. Is everything all right?" Charles turned his gaze to the Mark I tank. Compared to the rudimentary steel plates welded onto the tractor before, this was a tank specifically designed for battlefield combat. Once it was deployed, it would undoubtedly render all of Francis's tanks obsolete. No wonder Francis was nervous and eager to retaliate. "Everything is fine, young Master Charles," Joseph nodded, "but we think that if there's any extra payload, why not add a small caliber cannon to it?" Charles shook his head slightly. The idea of adding a cannon was tempting, and the Mark I tank had a cannon in history, but Charles wouldn't do that. Chapter 72 Mark I tank. Historically, the Mark I tank was divided into male and female versions. The male version was equipped with two 57mm main guns, one on each side of the protruding gun compartment, plus 4 Hotchkiss light machine guns. The female version was only equipped with 6 Vickers machine guns. This meant that the Mark I required an 8-person crew, a driver, a commander, and 6 machine gunners, or 2 gunners and 4 machine gunners, with a total weight of 28.4 tons. The Mark I tank currently under development by Char has reduced all its equipment to 3 machine guns, 1 Vickers machine gun at the front and 1 Hotchkiss on each side. Therefore, the crew is reduced to 5 people, a driver, a commander, and 3 machine gunners. Joseph and Djokovic both felt it was a pity, and they offered their suggestions. "Our engine has 83 horsepower, which can probably move a weight of 23 tons, but the Mark I, with its crew, weighs less than 19 tons, leaving a redundancy of about 4 tons. We could easily convert the Vickers machine gun into a cannon. A cannon would definitely inflict more damage on the enemy than a machine gun. Of course, it's still a cannon shell. It might destroy enemy sandbag fortifications, which a machine gun can't do." Djokovic and Joseph's estimates were quite accurate. The engine used in the British Mark I when it was invented in 1916 was 105 horsepower. 105 horsepower could move a 28.4-ton tank, so by that ratio, the 83 horsepower Holt 75 could move a 22.45-ton tank. This wasn't far off from their estimated 23 tons, and indeed, a small caliber cannon could be added. However, Charles still insisted on his own idea. "Use Vickers machine guns," Charles said. "The battlefield isn't about having the most firepower, sometimes it needs bullets more than shells." However, Charles didn't completely dismiss their idea. "We can produce tanks with small caliber cannons in small batches, but we'll remove the side machine guns, meaning we'll only carry 1 cannon, and we'll also increase the thickness of the frontal armor." Djoka and Joseph exchanged glances. They didn't think this was a wise move, because tanks needed machine gun cover on the sides. Otherwise, how could they prevent the enemy from approaching from the flanks? But Charles knew that their thinking stemmed from their lack of military knowledge. Joseph was a tractor factory manager who had spent his life studying tractors and knew nothing about the battlefield. Djoka came from a merchant family, and his understanding of military matters was limited to hunting rifles. They assumed that cannons were superior to machine guns and that every tank's defenses needed to be comprehensive. But the reality was quite the opposite. Tanks of this era lacked dual stabilization systems, they used the most primitive rigid suspension, and on rough terrain, they couldn't even maintain a level ride. Artillery, however, requires a level and stable base to calculate the trajectory and roughly hit the target. In short, mounting a cannon on an early tank meant it was impossible to hit anything. It was all down to luck. Its only role on the battlefield was to intimidate the enemy with its dark muzzle. Machine guns had similar problems, but their bullets covered a wide area, and the gunner could adjust the angle based on the bullet's impact point while firing, making them far more accurate than cannons. As for the tank's side and rear defenses, those should be left to infantry. Charles continued to produce tanks with cannons in small batches because he considered a scenario: if encountering enemy bunkers, tanks equipped only with machine guns would be ineffective, but cannons could get close enough to the bunkers to fire shells into their interiors. "How much longer until it's finished?" Charles asked. "Probably another week," Joseph replied. Charles was quite satisfied with his progress. Historically, the Mark I took about 6 months from design to the production of a prototype, while Joseph only needed a little over 2 weeks. This was largely due to Charles' mature design, which eliminated many weapons, especially the 2 turrets on the left and right sides, which would have placed a huge burden on the tank and made production extremely difficult. However, Charles' Mark I still had many flaws. The most serious was the track problem. Its maximum range was only 35 kilometers, requiring constant maintenance. After 35 kilometers, it wasn't just a matter of maintenance, the entire track had to be replaced, even before battle, otherwise it would break after a short time. Note, the original Mark I only had a range of 30 kilometers, however, Char wasn't worried about these issues. This was World War I, where both sides were still at the level of trench warfare, digging trenches and fighting each other. Trench was static. Once dug, it remained stationary. The Mark I could always reach the battlefield and always face enemy fire. It was just a matter of replacing a few tracks. It didn't need to consider tank mobility like in World War II. More importantly, only by making this tank imperfect could Char potentially upgrade it to a better, more perfect tank. Once the capitalists successfully copied the tank, a more advanced version from Charles would also emerge, instantly turning their copied tanks into piles of unsellable scrap metal. Charles and Dejoka worked at the factory until 9 p.m. before returning home, only managing to eat a few bites of dry bread with coffee when they got hungry. When they drove home, they were unsurprisingly met with Camille's fury. She was mainly targeting Dejoka. Charles rarely comes home, and you let him come back so late. I even prepared dinner. Do you know he has to go back to the army tomorrow? I didn't see you working overtime until 9 p.m. before Charles came back, so why are you working until now that he's back? Charles tried to defend Dejoka, who had indeed urged him to come back a few times. But Charles couldn't leave because there were many things about the Mark I that required his decisions. Dejoka and Joseph didn't understand military matters or the future. Some things were just a matter of a sentence for Charles, but Dejoka and Joseph needed to produce the product, verify it repeatedly, and compare it repeatedly. However, Camille wouldn't listen to any explanation. She turned her anger on Charles. Isn't the factory something adults should be more concerned about? Does the army need a 17-year-old like you, and the factory needs you too, developing equipment for the army? Aren't you worrying too much about this country? What Camille didn't know was that Charles wasn't worrying too much about the country, he was worrying about himself. Charles didn't know how the nobles would treat him in the future. All he could do was increase his bargaining power as much as possible. If he told Camille the whole story, she might not blame Charles. But she would be terrified and unable to eat or sleep. Charles didn't want it to be the latter, so neither he nor Joka offered any further explanation. Chapter 73 Why the rigid suspension of the Mark I cannot be equipped with cannons. Last night's chapter discussed how the Mark I tank didn't use a cannon, which raised some questions among readers. Let me explain. Before discussing tank cannons, let's compare it to a machine gun. A machine gun bipod, if placed on level ground, allows the gunner to easily aim at a target and fire in all directions. But what if the bipod is uneven? Rotating it left or right results in the muzzle pointing either upwards or downwards, and adjusting its height also leads to aiming at the enemy directly in front, even if they are very close. The Mark I was an early tank with rigid suspension, meaning it lacked a suspension system. The road wheels were directly connected to the hull. This caused a serious problem. Even a protruding rock or uneven ground would cause the tank to tilt to one side. In this situation, the cannon could not be aimed at the target, making it difficult to hit even at close range. Because the tank's unevenness caused the cannon to be uneven as well, and the gunner, inside the uneven tank and only observing through a small observation port, couldn't even tell if it was level. This rendered the cannon essentially useless. It couldn't aim or hit targets, and it caused a series of problems, such as toxic gases filling the entire tank compartment after firing and being unable to escape. This problem was partially solved in the Renault tank, which adopted a horizontal suspension system. Simply put, this is a triangular structure that converts vertical forces into horizontal forces. For example, if a protruding rock were to hit the tracks of a Renault tank, the horizontal suspension system would allow the road wheels to spread horizontally, causing the rock to sink between the road wheels, thus keeping the tank relatively level. In summary, the rigid suspension Mark I couldn't aim at targets even when stationary, unless the ground was perfectly flat. Even a rock hitting the tracks wouldn't help. The horizontally suspended Renault tank could aim at targets when stationary. Its suspension system was flexible. If the ground protruded, the load would sink in. If the ground dipped, the road wheels would protrude outwards. The tracks and the ground largely complemented each other, keeping the tank relatively level, as long as the ground wasn't excessively rugged. However, it couldn't fire while moving. Most tanks during World War II were unable to fire while moving, with two exceptions, the British Matilda and the American Sherman. The Matilda, due to its numerous road wheels and slow speed, was relatively stable while moving, allowing for some accuracy in firing while on the move. The Sherman had a vertical stabilization system, which kept the gun barrel vertically stable at an absolute height, also providing some accuracy in firing while moving. The true realization of firing while moving came with modern tanks, which incorporated lateral stabilization on top of vertical stabilization, a dual stabilization system. With a dual stabilization system, regardless of the tank's movement or turning, the gun barrel maintains a constant absolute position, allowing for actions like lifting a beer bottle or a wrench with a gun barrel. Conversely, the Mark I, on the other hand, was largely unknown to its developers. They simply wanted to mount a cannon on a tank and fire it, hence the rigid suspension and two main guns. While there are indeed instances of rigid suspension tanks achieving hits in actual combat, these were mostly close-range engagements, relying on intuition and luck. These exceptions don't prove anything. Knowing that rigid suspension cannot be used with cannons, the protagonist naturally chooses a surface-mounted machine gun as his main weapon. Chapter 74 Secret Mission. There's simply not enough time today. I haven't finished Chapter 3, so only 2 updates today. 3 more tomorrow. The next day was overcast. Paris was already shrouded in mist, and without the sun, it appeared even darker, with a faint sense of impending rain, creating a strangely oppressive atmosphere. The Paris garrison command was unusually busy that day. Normally, the fighting on the front lines wouldn't have much to do with the Paris garrison command anymore, since the front lines were far from Paris, and Paris was no longer in danger, so there was no need for garrisoning. However, the previous fighting had made Parliament less trusting of Joffre. Many believe that the heavy casualties suffered by the army, even plunging Paris into crisis, were due to Joffre's strategic errors. Before the war, France already knew about the German Schlieffen Plan. Almost everyone knew that the main German force would pass through Belgium and outflank Paris from the right flank. This was no secret. At this point, Joffre only needed to position the main French force to the north, digging trenches and fortifying the German marching route, and the French army wouldn't have suffered such heavy losses, and Paris wouldn't have been in danger. However, knowing the German offensive plans, Joffre still formulated the so-called Plans VI, a plan that unusually positioned the main French forces south of the border to attack Alsace and Lorraine. It perfectly complemented the German Schlieffen Plan, ultimately leading to the complete collapse of the French army. Some members of parliament believed that even spies couldn't achieve such seamless coordination. Joffre did exactly what the Germans wanted, knowing the German plans. However, Joffre was a hero cultivated by capitalists and the media, and they feared that dismissing or holding him accountable would damage the morale of the French military and civilians, so they didn't pursue the matter further. Note, if it had only happened once or twice, Parliament could have pretended nothing had happened, but in the subsequent war, Joffre invariably fell into every trap set by the Germans. Parliament finally lost patience and promoted him in name only. In 1916, he was promoted to Marshal, but simultaneously dismissed from his position as Commander-in-Chief. Parliament's final decision was, Joffre would remain Commander-in-Chief of the French army, but he must fully consider Gallieri's suggestions. In other words, although Gallieni was the commander of the Paris garrison, he had the authority to assist Joffre in commanding the French army. Intelligence from the front lines flooded Gallieni's desk, mainly from the Antwerp fortress in Belgium. General, a telegram from the Belgian army: if the situation doesn't improve, the Belgian government will have to withdraw from Antwerp within 3 days. The British army says they are unable to reinforce Antwerp. They hope we can send reinforcements. A telegram from the Belgian government: the Germans have launched another bombardment. Another Belgian fortress has been breached, and the situation is extremely critical. Gallieni frowned. The Antwerp fortress was crucial to the Allies. Its fall would almost certainly mean Belgium could no longer tie down German logistical supplies as before, allowing German ammunition to flow continuously to the French front through Belgium. Gallieni's first thought was of Charles. Could he possibly have a solution? But this idea was quickly dismissed. Charles wasn't God, and besides, This was a siege battle with cannons exchanging fire, a clash between fortress and steel. What could he possibly do? Therefore, when Gallieni saw Charles coming up the stairs, he merely nodded slightly and buried himself back in his documents. General, Colonel Durand stepped forward and reported, "The Commander-in-Chief wants us to send someone to Antwerp to investigate the situation and provide a detailed report." Gallieni grunted, his attention focused on the intelligence in his hands, and casually replied, "Go handle it." "Yes, General." Colonel Durand straightened up and turned to walk towards the stairs. He seemed hurried, not stopping or even tilting his head as he passed Charles, but he ordered in a deep voice, "Follow me, Lieutenant Charles. The General has a mission for you, an urgent mission." "Yes, Colonel," Charles responded. He had seen Colonel Durand talking to Gallieni, though he hadn't heard what they were saying. What kind of urgent mission could it be? Charles was curious. Was he going to stand guard or practice military posture? After going downstairs, Colonel Durand led Charles directly to the car, personally driving him to their destination. "We're going to the airport." As the car started moving, Colonel Durand explained while steering, "Your mission is to fly to a place called Antwerp. We need to know the detailed situation there, such as Belgian casualties, the number of surviving fortresses, enemy firepower and deployment, etc. Understand?" "Understood, sir," Charles replied. He was a little nervous. Going to the battlefield, he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Although it wasn't about fighting with a rifle but investigating, it was still dangerous. Then Colonel Durand reminded Charles, "This is a secret operation, Lieutenant. We can't let the Germans know that France is assessing Antwerp. It would let them know we have reinforcement plans. So, you can't discuss it with anyone, including the pilots." "Understand?" "Understood, sir." Charles nodded, swallowing hard. He felt a cool sensation on his face. However, he reassured himself, there would be no danger. If there were, General Gallieni wouldn't have sent him to this place. Perhaps this was just a test. This thought eased Charles's mind slightly. But soon he tensed up again. He hadn't even learned how to use a pistol. What if he encountered the enemy? Or was this mission going to be completely unplanned? The car pulled into a small airfield, and when Charles saw a toy-like wooden biplane parked on the platform, he turned pale with fright. Was he going to be taken to the battlefield in this thing? "I've never been on a plane before, Colonel." Charles nervously glanced at Colonel Durand. "You're lucky." Durand parked the car next to the plane and nodded to Charles. "You're about to ride in it?" Charles nervously got out of the car and walked towards the plane. Durand added from behind, "Don't worry, Lieutenant. This mission is safe. We've assigned you the best pilot." The pilot, sitting in the cockpit, turned around and grinned when he heard this. He was a middle-aged man with a greasy face and a small mustache. "Don't worry," the pilot shouted confidently to Charles, "there won't be any problems. I can drive it to its destination with my eyes closed." However, when Charles climbed into the cabin, he smelled a faint odor of alcohol. He looked at the pilot in alarm. "Uncle, have you been drinking?" The pilot turned around, waved a flask in his hand, and asked enthusiastically, "Want some, Charles?" Chapter 75 Antwerp Fortress. In the lounge next to the airport, Grevy and Armand sat facing each other at a table. They leisurely sipped their coffee, gazing at the airport where an Avro two-seater was taxiing on the runway, soon to take off. "Great idea." Armand raised his coffee slightly to Grevy across from him. "We've finally gotten him to a dangerous place." Grevy's eyes still held a hint of reluctance. He watched the plane grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared from sight, and sighed softly. If only he had agreed to join the right wing. With him, the right wing would completely suppress the left and achieve total victory. He had many infuriatingly creative ideas that even left-wing capitalists couldn't match. But if he couldn't be obtained, he had to be destroyed. Because the ideas in his mind had the potential to turn the entire right wing. "One question," Armand asked, "why don't we just stage an accident or a traffic incident, like malfunctioning the plane, instead of going through all this trouble to actually get him to the Antwerp fortress? That would make people suspicious of us." "Armand," Grevy replied coldly. "Everyone knows we have a conflict of interest with him. The left wing is watching us, the military is watching us, they want us to make a mistake so they can use that to get us out of the House of Representatives." A hint of confusion crossed Armand's face. He nodded in the direction the plane had disappeared. "Now, what's the difference?" "Of course there's a difference." Grevy picked up a spoon and stirred his coffee gently, a hint of pain in his eyes. "Now, Gallieni sent him to save the Antwerp fortress from danger. He died heroically in Antwerp. Do you think they'll report it that way, or that Charles's death is likely related to the right wing? Armand understood. This was related to the war. Just like everyone knew Joffre's incompetence, but no one wanted to remove him from his position as commander-in-chief. The only commendable thing Joffre did throughout the war was that he ate and slept on time, which the media exaggerated as the calm Joffre being a tranquilizer for France. He had been molded into a hero, a symbol, a myth, and a considerable portion of the French military and civilians had become accustomed to using him as a pillar of strength in their fight against the Germans. If the myth of Joffre were exposed, this pillar of strength would collapse, potentially triggering a disaster, or even a series of chain reactions leading to internal strife. Similarly, Charles had become the hope and pillar of strength for many. If Charles were to die in Antwerp, they would be more willing to portray it as a spirit of bravery and fearlessness, at least inspiring the French military and civilians to take to the battlefield and vent their anger on the Germans, rather than letting the truth reveal itself and cause internal strife. Armand nodded slightly. Even the usually cynical Armand unconsciously put away his smile. He realized that he was still different from Grevy and also recognized Grevy's terrifying nature. He glanced at Grevy while taking a sip of coffee. The latter was staring thoughtfully at the table, lost in thought. If one day they needed to resolve their internal conflicts, Armand knew he was no match for Grevy. He might die at Grevy's hands. Fortunately, the right wing saw no hope of victory, so he didn't need to worry about that. Thinking this, Armand's smile returned. On the biplane, wearing a flight cap and goggles, Charles's ears were filled with a rumbling of the engines and the whooshing of the wind. This type of aircraft had an open cockpit, with everything above the shoulders outside the fuselage, offering no protection against the fierce winds. If the speed hadn't been only a little over 100 kilometers per hour, Charles believed his nose would have been blown off. Soon, Charles saw a pointed, cylindrical balloon emerging from the clouds in the distance. It was as large as an alien spaceship, lazily floating in the air, like a fat man just waking up, turning over listlessly and laboriously. At first, Charles thought it was a French balloon, but when he saw the German insignia on the side, he exclaimed, "A German balloon! That's an enemy balloon." "What?" The pilot didn't hear him clearly. "The enemy. That's the enemy." Charles pointed frantically in the direction of the balloon, thinking the pilot was drunk and couldn't distinguish friend from foe, actually approaching an enemy balloon. But the pilot calmly replied, "Yes, so what? Do you want to go see it?" Suddenly, Charles remembered something. In the early stages of World War I, both sides' air forces had almost no offensive capabilities. Planes and balloons were mostly used for reconnaissance, so when aircraft met, they would even wave to each other. Just as the thought crossed his mind, a German plane flew overhead. Although the two planes didn't wave as rumored, nothing happened, just like two cars passing each other on a highway. "Don't worry, Lieutenant," the pilot shouted back, "if there's any place that's safe, it's here. Nobody can do anything to you, not even the enemy below." Charles followed the pilot's gaze downwards and was surprised to find that the plane was flying over a zone of enemy conflict. Shells were rising like mushrooms of smoke below, the sound of artillery fire barely audible, masked by the engines and wind. Charges of soldiers, like swarms of ants, charged back and forth in ridiculous formations through the sand dunes. The entire position was shrouded in a gray haze, indistinguishable between the air and the ground. Charles sensed something was wrong and asked the pilot, "Where are we going?" "To the Antwerp fortress, of course," the pilot retorted. "What else?" "Antwerp is in enemy territory," Charles asked again. "Not in enemy-occupied territory," the pilot replied. "It's north of Belgium, near the coast." If it weren't for the strong wind, Charles would have pulled out a map to look it up by now, but at this moment he could only visualize it in his mind. North of Belgium, the Germans had broken through Belgium, meaning it had been cut off by the Germans, and that fortress should be surrounded by the Germans. He was actually going to have to venture into the enemy's encirclement to investigate? Fortunately, Charles remembered that the pilot had just said Antwerp was near the coast, which meant that the fortress wasn't completely besieged by the Germans. Because Charles knew that the sea belonged to Britain, and the German navy was under blockade. Perhaps it was because of the plane, Charles thought. People in this era probably generally believed that airplanes were safe, and General Gallieni was no exception, which was why he was assigned this mission. Even now, Charles didn't realize that this wasn't actually a mission given to him by Gallieni. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.